the village of Dexter. Received a call from the sheriff's department stated that an unidentified object had been sighted out off the McGinnis Road at Frank Manor Farm.
Well, we got to the Frank Manor Farm, and he met Mr. Manners. He took us around to the side porch, which overlooks the swamp, where Offiicial and I got out the binoculars and looked down to the swamp. We saw this object down in the swamp.
The object looked like a pair of headlights, except it was spread farther out.
The deputies went off to the east, and Offiicial and I went to the west, searching around. We came to the high ridge. We came up on this high ridge and we played our flashlight down where the object was.
Apparently it's seen their lights, their flashlight, and it went out just like that.
At that point, we heard this sound, like electronic sound take off, and it sounded like it shot up into the air.
Over the top of the house, sounded like you'd been in a big tunnel and shot a high-powered rifle off and singing that bullet to a terrific speed. Real high frequency sound.
Following a wave of UFO reports in Michigan in 1966, Project Blue Book scientific advisor Dr. J. Allen Hynek was called upon to investigate the sightings and calm the public. Dr. Hynek was unable to come up with an explanation for the sightings. With no time to spare, Dr. Hynek would come up with an explanation that would live in infamy.
That I emphasize in conclusion that I cannot prove in a court of law that marsh gas is the full explanation of these sightings. But it does appear to me extremely likely.
The marsh gas explanation angered many in the area.
They were seeing disc-shaped objects, several disc-shaped objects, flying in formations and flying all around the sky, so this explanation makes no sense at all to us.
Dr. Hynek did not talk to me. He did come out to the area, and I guess he inspected it, but he didn't find anything, and he didn't talk to me anymore at all after that.
The swamp gas, there is swamp gas. I don't know, I've never seen none right in this vicinity, but as far as it going 2,000 feet in the air, and other people have seen it that high, they just got to come up with something better than that.
Calls for a further inquiry were made by local Congressman J. Edward Roosh.
People want to know what a UFO is, and therefore any chance that we have to learn, we should take advantage of it. When you tell an American, I can't explain it, he wants to know, why can't you explain it? Why doesn't someone explain it? I want someone to explain it.
And future President and local Congressman Gerald Ford would also speak on the UFOs and call for a congressional inquiry.
House Minority Leader Gerald Ford said this today.
The Congress should investigate the rash of reported sightings of unidentified flying objects in southern Michigan and other parts of the country.
And this is where we'll pick up for this video. After nearly 2 decades of lobbying efforts by Donald Kehoe, NICAP, APRO, and various other civilian UFO groups, the United States of America was finally going to have its first set of Congressional UFO hearings. We will cover these first Congressional UFO hearings and the subsequent actions that followed. The culmination of the events we will cover in this video would ultimately lead to the end of Project Blue Book and cause the American scientific community to turn their backs on UFOs.
An eminent scientist who at one time agreed with Menzel but has now changed his mind is...
We have not been hiding anything. The investigations have been made public.
In my association with Project Blue Book, I know very well that it was not a scientific project.
Program Project Blue Book, run by the Air Force, and I have quite unequivocally described it to scientific colleagues back in the States as superficial and incompetent.
The choice is, we can either call all these people over these years, all of them crazy, or we must say there is a real phenomenon there that is worthy of investigation.
Some sources and further reading can be found in the books Firestorm, Dr. James E. McDonald's Fight for UFO Science by Ann Druffel. The Close Encounters Man, How One Man Made the World Believe in UFOs by Mark O'Connell. The Scientific Study of Unidentified Flying Objects, Dr. Edward Condon and the Colorado Project. Carl Sagan, A Life by Key Davidson. The Forbidden Sciences series by Jacques Vallée. The Proceedings of the Science Historical Group. UFOs, Yes, Where the Condon Committee Went Wrong. The Inside Story by an ex-member of the Official Study Group, David Saunders and Roger Harkins. UFOs, An Air Force Dilemma by Hector Quintanilla. And the websites Project 1947, NICAP, and the Science Historical Group. These and other reference documents can be found in the description. Thanks to the following people for reviewing some of the more technical scientific parts of this video. Kurt Mungle from the channel Theories of Everything, Jeremy Reese from the channel Alien Scientist, and the following Twitter users.
CBS reports UFO, friend, foe, or fantasy. Reported by CBS News correspondent Walter Cronkite.
Good evening. Reports of flying saucers are nothing new. From the beginning of recorded time, men have been seeing unexplainable things in the sky, and there's no reason to doubt they saw something. The question is, was what they saw really there?
Immediately following the Michigan wave, in the weeks leading up to the first Congressional UFO hearings, the Air Force was very active. They made the CBS UFO debunking documentary, UFOs, Friend, Foe, or Fantasy.
First of all, the objects are not unidentified. We know what they are. Second, in many cases, in most cases, they're not flying. And finally, in many cases, they are not even material objects.
The official Air Force reply has long been that there is no cover-up and there are no flying saucers from outer space. The Air Force position was detailed in this book by Lieutenant Colonel Lawrence Tacker, who for many years was connected with the UFO project.
Our critics continually charge that the United States Air Force is withholding information from the general public on this subject. This is absolutely untrue. We are not hiding anything. We have nothing to hide.
Has there ever been a report of a flying saucer, Captain, that was translated into hard information right here? A plot on the board in this room?
I don't think so, Bill. For the reason that these sightings have never been substantiated and could not be translated into hard radar return figures.
Along with working on the CBS Michigan debunking documentary, the Air Force also convened the O'Brien Panel, an ad hoc scientific committee led by biophysicist and engineer Brian O'Brien. And this panel was convened to review UFOs and Project Blue Book following the Michigan wave. The specific objectives of the O'Brien panel were to review the resources and methods of investigation prescribed by Project Blue Book, and to advise the Air Force of any improvements that can be made in the program to enhance the Air Force's capability in investigating UFOs. After reviewing Project Blue Book, the conclusions of the O'Brien panel were that the UFO investigations were earnest, but perhaps the project should be increased in scope as more personnel and resources would assist in data collection. The findings of the O'Brien panel were to be presented at the upcoming hearing by the Secretary of the Air Force, Harold D. Brown. Harold D. Brown was one of 3 Air Force witnesses that was to face the congressional hearing, which was now just weeks away. The other 2 Air Force witnesses scheduled to appear at the hearing were the Chief of Project Blue Book, Hector Quintanilla, and the Chief Scientific Advisor, J. Allen Hynek. And each of these men had strong feelings about the upcoming hearing. Quintanilla was nervous and embarrassed about the upcoming hearing. It was his job to keep the UFO issue down, and a congressional hearing on UFOs was just about the worst thing that could happen to him. Dr. J. Allen Hynek was still angry and bitter over the events in Michigan. He felt like he had been used as a patsy by the Air Force for the swamp gas debunk, and Hynek felt that the Air Force had left him out to dry. Hynek and Quintanilla were called to the Pentagon to discuss the upcoming hearing and to make sure that they were prepared for questioning. They were instructed not to lose their tempers under any circumstances, to think about their responses, and to answer truthfully. And if they did not have an answer to a question, they were instructed to respond accordingly and not be ashamed. The Pentagon officials then asked Hynek and Quintanilla if they planned on making a prepared statement at the hearing, to which both men said no. And with all the prep done, it was now time for the first Congressional UFO hearing. The first Congressional hearing on UFOs was held by the House Armed Services Committee on April 5, 1966, about a month after the Michigan UFO wave. This hearing was a closed session, not open to the public. Congressman Gerald Ford would note the ridicule he received in calling this hearing, stating in a press release, "As I had expected, some persons have ridiculed my call for a congressional investigation of unidentified flying objects. These people are a fraction of those who have given me their reaction to my proposal. The overwhelming majority of those expressing a view in letters to me believe a congressional investigation would be useful and is needed." The hearing then called upon the three Air Force witnesses: the Secretary of the Air Force, Harold Brown, the Chief of Project Blue Book, Hector Quintanilla, and the Chief Scientific Advisor, J. Allen Hynek. Harold D. Brown, the Secretary of the Air Force, was the first of the witnesses to appear before the hearing. Secretary Brown was calm, cool, and collected, and he read his prepared statement reciting the Air Force view that no evidence existed that UFOs were a national security threat or extraterrestrial in origin. And he also mentioned the O'Brien panel and their recommendations by expanding the scope of Project Blue Book. The next witness was Chief of Project Blue Book, Hector Quintanilla. He was extremely nervous at the hearing because many high-ranking Air Force officials were present. Quintanilla was asked if he was going to make a statement, to which he replied, no. Then, the last witness from the Air Force was called upon, Dr. J. Allen Hynek, the Chief Scientific Advisor to Project Blue Book. A congressman asked Dr. Hynek, "Is there anything you would like to say?" Hynek had previously told the Pentagon that he was not going to make a statement like Quintanilla. However, he changed his plans, still angry and feeling used by the Air Force over the Michigan debunk. Hynek replied, "Mr. Chairman, the press has recently treated me rather unkindly. The press has described me as a puppet of the Air Force and has stated that I say only what the Air Force tells me to say. I would like to do something, which may be a little daring, and to read to the committee a statement I have prepared which has certainly not been dictated by the Air Force." Hynek's announcement that he had a statement drew audible gasps from the Air Force officials present, expecting him to not say anything. Some quotes from Hynek's statement are, "As a scientist, I must be mindful of the reasons of the past. All too often it has happened that matters of great value of science were overlooked because the new phenomenon simply did not fit the accepted scientific outlook of the time. I am happy that my appearance before this committee affords me a chance to once again reiterate my recommendations. Specifically, it is my opinion that the body of data accumulated since 1948 through the Air Force investigations deserves close scrutiny by a civilian panel of physical and social scientists, and this panel should be asked to examine the UFO problem critically for the express purpose of determining whether a major problem really exists." Project Blue Book Chief Hector Quintanilla could not believe what he was hearing. To Quintanilla, Hynek was attempting a coup of the UFO program at one of the most tumultuous moments in the history of Project Blue Book. Hynek had told the Pentagon he wasn't going to make a statement, and that was a lie. And the statement he did make was critical of the Air Force. This was a major embarrassment for Quintanilla, especially since many top Air Force brass were in the audience. Following the prepared statements, the hearing was then transferred to a question and answer phase about the practices and methodologies of Project Blue Book. Over the course of the hearing, it was decided that the Air Force would negotiate contracts with universities and would choose a university or nonprofit to review Project Blue Book and temporarily take over UFO investigations. And with this decree that a university or nonprofit was to be chosen to review Project Blue Book, the first Congressional UFO hearings would close. And although Hynek had grown some courage during the hearing, immediately following the hearing, in front of the news cameras, Hynek would continue along the Air Force line.
None of the evidence that I have examined would indicate any proof at all that we are being visited by extraterrestrials.
What is the Air Force hiding in this investigation? We have not been hiding anything. The investigations have been made public. The explanations of those where there is a clear explanation have been made public. The hearing this morning was public for just that reason.
An astrophysicist, Dr. Alan Hynek, investigator for the Air Force, has said, "I don't like a mystery. A mystery is an itch that should be scratched." He concluded, "I've recommended that competent scientists quietly study the cases when evidence from responsible people appears to warrant such a study." The Air Force has told Congress it probably will name a scientific panel to investigate UFOs in depth.
The weeks following the first Congressional UFO hearing, while the Air Force was searching for a university to take the UFO contract, were a difficult time for Hynek. His conscience was weighing heavier and heavier about his role in the UFO cover-up, causing him to become severely depressed. For 2 decades, he had covered up for the Air Force, providing prosaic explanations to cases that were unknown. When UFO groups started appearing around the country, it was Hynek who went to their leaders on behalf of the Air Force to convince the UFO groups to go along with the debunking line in exchange for special access and information. And when Edward Ruppelt, Albert Chopp, and Dewey Fournet attempted to make a motion picture about the realities of the UFO phenomena, it was Hynek who was called upon to discredit his former colleagues. J. Allen Hynek felt he had abdicated his duties to science by going along with this lie, only to be used and discarded by a disloyal Air Force. Sure, at the congressional hearing he had shown a little resistance to the Air Force, but was that enough? While J. Allen Hynek was in this depressed mental state, he would receive a visit in his office from a distinguished physicist and meteorologist named James McDonald. But who is James McDonald, and why was he walking into Hynek's office? James McDonald was born on May 7, 1920. From a young age, he was fascinated by the night sky and space. During World War II, he served in the United States Navy as a cryptographer, and when he returned to school, his scientific interest shifted towards atmospheric physics, and he would go on to get degrees in pursuit of atmospheric physics. James McDonald received a bachelor's degree in chemistry from the University of Omaha. He then earned a master's degree in meteorology from MIT, followed by a PhD in physics from Iowa State University. By the 1950s, James McDonald was considered a specialist of atmospheric phenomena. His specialty was cloud formations, meteorology, and physics. He published hundreds of papers on these subjects, and McDonald created 7,000 meteorological terms that are still in use today. James McDonald also became a member of the American Meteorological Society and the Institute of Atmospheric Physics, and he would use his knowledge to also complete scientific contracts for the Navy related to the atmosphere and meteorology. In 1953, James McDonald was recruited by the University of Arizona to help establish an atmospherics and meteorology program. McDonald enjoyed Arizona's open skies and the on-campus observatory that he was free to use as he wished. Although McDonald had been recruited for a leadership position, after a year, he resigned as an administrator so he could focus on fieldwork, something he much preferred. And in Arizona, with his wife Betsy, the McDonalds would have 6 children, 2 sons and 4 daughters. James McDonald's foray into the world of UFOs would begin in 1954, when he would witness a UFO with 2 other meteorologists while driving through the desert. The team of meteorologists saw a shining object with the appearance of aluminum hovering over the Santa Rita Mountains. James McDonald was perplexed by his sighting, and despite the combined experience of the witnesses present, none of them could identify the strange object. James McDonald returned to the University of Arizona Astronomy Department to check the astronomy records to see if the UFO was perhaps Venus or another star or planet. After investigating the astronomy department records, James McDonald determined that the UFO he and his fellow meteorologists witnessed was not Venus or any other star or planet. Unsure of what he saw, James McDonald did the proper thing and reported his sighting to the Air Force in Project Blue Book. Like most Americans, he was under the impression that Project Blue Book was a thorough scientific inquiry, and the Project Blue Book personnel who received McDonald's report assured him that his sighting would be thoroughly investigated, especially since he was a distinguished physicist who could relay proper information. Through the late 1950s, McDonald didn't really focus on UFOs, and he turned down offers from Richard Hall of NICAP to join the congressional lobbying efforts of the late 1950s. However, as the 1960s came around, McDonald started to become suspicious of the Air Force UFO inquiry. He had yet to hear any follow-up on his initial sighting, and after his sighting, he began to notice anomalous UFO cases appearing here and there in the news, with weak, prosaic explanations provided by the Air Force. In the early 1960s, James McDonald decided to start interviewing alleged UFO witnesses around the Tucson, Arizona area. He also began to collect case files from NICAP and the civilian saucer investigators. Upon investigating UFOs, James McDonald would begin to receive ridicule from his fellow University of Arizona faculty. Nevertheless, after interviewing hundreds of alleged witnesses and reading thousands of UFO case files, his confidence in the Air Force UFO inquiry began to fade. The illusion would further be broken in 1966 when the Air Force explained the Michigan sightings as swamp gas, despite the testimony of various witnesses, many being police officers.
That I emphasize in conclusion that I cannot prove in a court of law that marsh gas is the full explanation of these sightings. But it does appear to me extremely likely.
James McDonald was now fully convinced that something was up, and he wanted to figure out why the Air Force would lie with the marsh gas debunk. Because of his prior government work, James McDonald was able to negotiate a small contract from the Office of Naval Research to conduct his own UFO study, separate of the Air Force. With the Navy's blessing, and with new security clearances, James McDonald would head to the home of Project Blue Book, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Upon arriving at Wright-Patterson, McDonald realized that Project Blue Book was even worse than he had feared. Instead of finding multiple offices with scientists and Air Force officials all dedicated to investigating UFOs, he found the Project Blue Book chief, Hector Quintanilla, and a small limited staff that lacked the ability to properly investigate anything. Project Blue Book was very different from the image the Air Force was portraying to the American people. Hector Quintanilla allowed McDonald to browse the Project Blue Book files. McDonald found the files they kept were lacking. They were not thorough investigations into UFO sightings, but rather weak collections of news articles. James McDonald searched for the file for his original 1954 sighting, and he couldn't find it. McDonald found himself disgusted at the state of the so-called UFO program. Then, for reasons unknown, Hector Quintanilla allowed James McDonald to read the Robertson Panel Report. It's important to note that at this time, the Robertson Panel Report was not publicly available. James McDonald was one of the first Americans in the country to read the report from 1953. As he read, he learned of the government propaganda plan to demystify UFOs amongst the American people, and his disgust turned to rage. He learned about Air Force Regulation 200-2, which mandated only positively identified UFO sightings were to be reported to the press. And he learned of JANAP 146, which made it a federal crime with the Espionage Act for commercial or military pilots to report UFO sightings. He couldn't believe what he was reading. Clear as day, the UFO cover-up was an official policy. He was angry at the Air Force and Hector Quintanilla for lying to the public, but above all, he was most angry with J. Allen Hynek. For nearly 2 decades, J. Allen Hynek had been the public scientific face of Project Blue Book. Hynek's endorsement of the UFO program assured other scientists that the Air Force was on top of the UFO issue. 20 years of scientific development were lost, never to be gained, because of Hynek's lies. He left Wright-Patterson and headed to Northwestern University to confront Hynek. After storming into Hynek's office, McDonald told Hynek, "You betrayed your responsibility to science, Allen. You should have spoken out years ago." Hynek, on the verge of tears, replied, "You just don't understand the situation, do you, Jim? Where were you when I tried to get support from the academic community?" Hynek stated that if he had spoken out, they would have replaced him, and he had kids that he was putting through college and needed the Air Force check. This angered James, who also had daughters in college, but eventually they were able to cool their heads and have a discussion. James McDonald's timing couldn't have been better. If you will recall, Hynek was already at his lowest point following the Michigan wave and the marsh gas debunk, and J. Allen Hynek would credit this interaction with James McDonald with being the event that pushed him over the edge and would cause him to publicly break ranks with the Air Force for the first time. Because of the confrontation with McDonald, J. Allen Hynek would publicly advocate for the serious study of UFOs with the publication of his letter, UFOs Merit Scientific Study, released in the October 1966 issue of Science magazine. In this article, he cites several common misconceptions on UFOs and is critical of the Air Force. And Hynek is critical of the scientific community as well, stating, quote, "I cannot dismiss the UFO phenomenon with a shrug. The hard data cases contain frequent allusions to recurrent kinematic, geometric, and luminescent characteristics. I've begun to feel that there is a tendency in 20th century science to forget that there will be a 21st century science, and indeed a 30th century science, from which vantage point our knowledge of the universe may appear quite different. We suffer perhaps from temporal provincialism, a form of arrogance that has always irritated posterity." Major Hector Quintanilla was disappointed and angry that Hynek would come out against the Air Force, and he stated that Hynek lost his usefulness to the project. Hector Quintanilla then went on to limit Hynek's access to the Blue Book case files. After nearly 2 decades of service to the Air Force, J. Allen Hynek was no longer a welcome member of Project Blue Book. Upon the release of his coming out article, Hynek would receive some of the UFO stigma that he had spent years propagating. Jacques Vallée was Hynek's assistant at this time, and he notes in his diary, "His colleagues' attitudes towards him is changing to the point of contempt, and this pains him. He is no longer taken seriously among astronomers." It didn't matter that J. Allen Hynek had been the scientific advisor for Project Blue Book for nearly 20 years. When he came out in support of UFOs, he suffered the stigma and ridicule all the same. In late 1966, the main UFO advocates were Donald Keyhoe and NICAP, Jim and Cora Lorenzen of APRO, the various UFO groups around the country, and newly added were respected scientists James McDonald and Dr. J. Allen Hynek. James McDonald and J. Allen Hynek, being public advocates, helped boost the UFO cause.
Dr. James McDonald, professor of atmospheric physics at the University of Arizona, in the midst of much professional disbelief, he is a respected scientist who feels the time has come to take a good hard look at the evidence.
As extremely urgent, because here is a really unusual problem that is going unattended by the scientific community throughout the world. Great many cases of disturbance of car engines. Cars have been stopped. I suppose that there must be 100 to 150 rather well authenticated cases of cars stopped. Apparently the situation is no different in England, Russia. I've been in Australia recently, and I think it's scientifically, almost scandalous that we're ignoring this long-standing problem in the way that we in the scientific community have ignored it.
Well, now, what is the attitude of science towards UFOs?
Oh, it's beginning to change, but it is still largely skeptical, and it's quite understandable. They have been assured that the problem has been looked at by... When you go to the witnesses in many of these cases, when you sort through, there are so many examples of highly credible witnesses, completely stable people of excellent reputation when you check around a bit, who have seen utterly unconventional objects maneuvering at low or sometimes high altitude, that to regard this as anything but a problem of considerable scientific importance, I think will be to miss something that we've already missed far too long.
An eminent scientist who at one time agreed with Menzel, but has now changed his mind, is Dr. J. Allen Hynek, head of astronomy at Chicago's Northwestern University.
At one time I thought that reports were confined largely to the United States, and that we were undergoing some sort of a bizarre nervous reaction. But their reports have come in now from better than 70 countries, and also scientists are beginning to take a closer look, because the sheer force of sheer weight, I should say, of the numbers of reports is demanding attention.
Science doesn't want to sanctify it because it regards the evidence as not good scientific evidence. So you have a vicious cycle that's not very common in science. We don't usually move ahead into areas this way in science, and so...
In October of 1966, the Secretary of Defense revealed which university would receive the UFO investigation contract as mandated by Congress. Northwestern University, the University of Arizona, and Harvard University were all barred from receiving the Air Force contract as Hynek, McDonald, and Dr. Donald Menzel were too close to the UFO issue. Interestingly, MIT was offered the contract, but they turned it down. The University of Colorado would ultimately be the school to get the Air Force contract to investigate UFOs and Project Blue Book, and to head this project was Dr. Edward Condon. Edward Condon was born on March 2, 1902, in Alamogordo, New Mexico. His family were devout Quakers, and he would maintain his Quaker religion for life. When Condon was 5 years old, his family moved to the San Francisco Bay Area, and this is where Edward Condon would spend his youth and teenage years. A young Edward Condon's major interests were science and writing, and in high school he was on the debate team and also wrote for the Berkeley High School newspaper. Edward Condon graduated from high school in 1919. After graduating from high school, Edward Condon worked as a journalist for the Oakland Inquirer. Being a journalist, Condon witnessed corruption at the hands of politicians, and he became disgusted with the state of the world. He saw city leaders and politicians lie with no remorse or repercussions, often at the detriment of those in society with no means to defend themselves. Edward Condon's time as a reporter coincided with the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, and the thrusting of communism onto the world stage. Edward Condon was sympathetic to some of the values espoused by the new Soviet government, a fairly common sentiment amongst academics at the time, especially in the San Francisco Bay Area. But along with the Soviet Revolution came the first Red Scare in America, an extreme paranoia of communist agents amongst the American populace. And this political climate would eventually prove detrimental to Condon. Edward Condon was tasked with covering a local labor movement in which the police had framed some of the members of the movement with crimes they had not committed. Condon was called upon by the police department to testify against the leaders of the labor movement, and he refused. This refusal led Condon to becoming the target of harassment from the local police, and he soon would quit being a reporter altogether and lean into the physical sciences. Condon would say, quote, "The effect of this involvement on me was to wipe out any desire to be even an educated newspaperman, so I entered the university and went into physical science, largely as a means of escape from the corruption of the world, in addition to the fact that I was genuinely interested in physical science." In 1921, after 3 years of journalism, Edward Condon enrolled at UC Berkeley in their College of Chemistry. After a year of chemistry, Condon would run into one of his old high school teachers, who had recently joined the physics faculty at Berkeley, and because of this run-in with his old teacher, Condon would change his life's trajectory and take up a new major, theoretical physics. Edward Condon was soon immersed in the world of physics and theoretical physics. At its core, physics is a branch of science that studies matter, momentum, force, energy, and the ways that they interact and behave through space and time. There are many subfields of physics, like classical mechanics, which describes the behavior of solids, gases, and fluids; thermodynamics, which deals with the properties of heat, work, and temperature; electromagnetism, which deals with the properties of electricity; optics, which studies the behavior and properties of light and the electrode; and there was Edward Condon's major, theoretical physics. Theoretical physics is a subfield of physics that employs mathematical models and abstractions of physical objects and systems to rationalize, explain, and predict natural phenomena. During this time, the field of physics in America was in its infancy and underdeveloped when compared to Europe. According to Condon, In the 1920s, most Americans didn't even know what physics was. Nevertheless, Berkeley would go on to develop one of the best physics programs in the country, and along with Edward Condon, Berkeley would come to foster physics minds like Ernest Lawrence, J. Robert Oppenheimer, and Philip Morrison. At Berkeley, Edward Condon received his undergraduate degree in theoretical physics in 1924, then PhD in physics in 1926. After completing his PhD, also in theoretical physics, Condon would decide to further his education in one of the physics capitals of the world, Germany. In 1926, Edward Condon arrived in Germany for a 2-year teaching fellowship, where he studied at the University of Gutenberg. Condon would grow close with fellow American physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer, who was also in Germany to further his physics education. Condon and Oppenheimer enjoyed Germany and all of the cutting-edge physics they were absorbing. At this time, Germany was one of the physics epicenters of the world, and physicists like Erwin Schrödinger, Werner Heisenberg, and Max Born were pioneering a new field of physics called quantum mechanics, a subfield of physics that describes the behavior of atoms and of the particles and forces that compose atoms. Quantum mechanics was created to account for the newly established quantum model of the atom. In order to better understand what quantum mechanics is, let's briefly review the history of man's understanding of the atom and the different atomic models that were developed over time. The word atom is derived from the ancient Greek word atomos, which means uncuttable. The earliest concepts of the nature of the atom were debated in ancient India and ancient Greece. The modern atomic model would begin to take shape nearly 2,000 years later. In 1803, John Dalton created the first modern atomic model, the solid sphere model. He theorized that different elements were composed of entirely different atoms, which had different properties. Atoms from different elements can form compounds, creating new properties, but the atoms themselves would not change. This early atomic model was thought to describe the smallest unit of a substance and had no subatomic particles. Through various instrumentations, scientists were able to determine the mass of different atoms, and this is what would form the basis of the periodic table. Different elements had different atomic mass and different properties. Some of the next major discoveries would occur around the turn of the 20th century. In the 1890s, it was discovered that while most naturally occurring atoms were stable, some elements with the large atomic mass, like uranium or radium, were unstable and would spontaneously release energy, referred to as rays, and change their atomic mass without outside influence, becoming a new atom. This process would be called radioactive decay, and the residual energy released would be called radiation. There were 3 different types of radiation discovered: alpha, beta, and gamma, each with different energy levels and able to penetrate different kinds of substances. This radiation process indicated that atoms were not the smallest unit of a substance, but that atoms were composed of even smaller subcomponents. Through experimentation, it was discovered that atoms were composed of positive and negative charges. The electron was first identified in 1897. Electrons are subatomic particles with a negative charge. To account for the discovery of negative and positive charges within an atom, the atomic model was updated to the plum-pudding model in 1904. The plum-pudding model theorized that atoms were composed of both positive and negative charges. In the plum-pudding model, atoms contain the recently discovered negatively charged subatomic particles, electrons, and these were thought to be scattered across a positively charged sea. In 1911, Ernest Rutherford discovered the proton, a subatomic particle that contained a positive charge, and that were nearly 2,000 times more massive than electrons. To account for protons and other discoveries, the atomic model would be updated once again to the nuclear model. The nuclear model theorized that positively charged components of an atom did not exist in a plum-pudding sea scattered across the atom, but rather the nuclear model stated that positive charges found in atoms were located in subatomic particles called protons. And these protons were contained in a small central component of the atom called the nucleus. The protons contained within the nucleus were determined to be held together by an intensely strong binding force. In the nuclear model, the negatively charged electrons were now positioned in an orbit around the proton-filled nucleus. The electrons were held in place with a binding force as well, though not as strong as the binding force holding together the protons within the nucleus. The number of protons in a nucleus is called the atomic number and determines the identity of an atom, and the periodic table was now organized based on atomic number instead of atomic mass. And the electrons orbiting a neutron would determine how an atom would interact with other atoms. Atoms of different elements could interact with each other through the sharing or taking of electrons and forming of molecules. The opposing positive and negative forces of the protons and electrons attracted each other and helped keep this orbit in a fixed position. The opposite is true for subatomic particles with the same charge. Strong forces prevented outside subatomic particles with the same charge from connecting, making it nearly impossible to use protons and electrons as tools to manipulate atoms, because they would be repelled by these strong positive and negative forces. In 1913, Niels Bohr introduced the planetary model of the atom, which stated that electrons orbiting a nucleus were doing so in orbits of fixed sizes and energy. And in 1919, a major discovery was made. Scientists took alpha radiation particles from radioactive decay that we covered earlier and bombarded nitrogen, and were able to penetrate the nuclear forces in the nitrogen gas into an isotope of oxygen. This changing of a nitrogen atom to an oxygen isotope accomplished the first artificial transmutation of an atom, the first artificially induced nuclear reaction of an otherwise stable element. There were some limitations to this method, however. The alpha radiation particles could only penetrate light elements, and alpha particles were unable to penetrate the nucleus of elements with higher atomic numbers. In 1926, when Edward Condon was beginning his physics career, the atomic model was once again updated to Schrödinger's quantum model. Like previous models, the quantum model theorized that the atoms consist solely of a central nucleus containing positively charged protons, and orbiting the nucleus are negatively charged electrons. Schrödinger's quantum model would differ from previous atomic models by theorizing that subatomic particles move so erratically it was impossible to know their exact locations and momentum at a given time, and that the electrons orbiting the nucleus at different energy levels were doing so in clouds of probability. Since the nature of subatomic particles in the Schrödinger model are rooted in approximations that could not be represented by classical physics and mechanics, quantum mechanics was developing to account for this nature that relied on probability and approximations. Quantum mechanics utilizes probability to measure approximations of a given particle's energy, momentum, and other physical properties. And quantum mechanics would employ wave mechanics as well as matrix mechanics, which used algebraic matrices to represent the different states of subatomic particles. Edward Condon and Robert Oppenheimer enjoyed their time in Germany. They were on the cutting edge of physics, studying under European scientists pioneering quantum mechanics. Both Oppenheimer and Condon were quick learners and highly proficient in quantum mechanics and quantum theory, and before long it was time for Edward Condon to return to America with all he had learned. Using the knowledge he obtained in Germany, Edward Condon began touring US universities, helping bring knowledge of quantum mechanics to the United States. In 1929, in cooperation with Philip M. Morse, Edward Condon wrote Quantum Mechanics, the first English language text on the subject, and Condon was credited with discovering the Condon-Shortley phase, the Frank-Condon principle, and the Slater-Condon rules, all principles of quantum mechanics that are still used today. Before long, Edward Condon was a nationally recognized leader in atomic physics and quantum mechanics. Edward Condon joined the American Physical Society, the American Society of Photogrammetry, the National Academy of Sciences, and the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Edward Condon became a professor at Princeton, which had one of the leading physics programs in the country. At Princeton, he would become acquainted with fellow physics professor H.P. Robertson, who would later run the CIA's Robertson panel. In 1932, while Condon was still at Princeton, another revolutionary discovery would be made to the structure of the atom: the discovery of the neutron. The neutron is a subatomic particle that contains no charge, and is positioned in the nucleus along with positively charged protons. The negatively charged electrons were still orbiting the nucleus in fixed orbits. Since the newly discovered neutron has neither a positive or negative charge, neutrons would not be repelled by the strong forces that affected protons and electrons, and it was discovered neutrons could bombard most elements, unlike the alpha radiation, which could only manipulate elements with low atomic numbers. Neutrons were able to penetrate the nuclei of elements with larger atomic numbers, and because of this, neutrons could be used as a tool in ways that other subatomic particles could not be.
Imagine that this billiard ball is a proton. No stream of light particles like electrons, no known type of wave, could have any more effect on such a body than these rice grains have on the billiard ball. But another particle of equal mass would share its energy on collision, just as this second ball imparts half its energy to the first as it pushes it away. A particle of unit mass, but without electric charge, and so very difficult to detect.
Scientists soon began taking the newly discovered neutron and bombarding different elements of the periodic table. Often these experiments would result in the creation of separate isotopes for a given element, or combining and transforming elements into completely different substances. The process of nuclear fusion would be discovered during this time, the combination of two lighter atoms or particles into larger ones. And this process would create new substances, and often some particles and energy would be released in the process. The discovery of the neutron in nuclear fusion raised the relative significance of atomic physics and quantum mechanics. And like many physicists following the discovery of the neutron, Condon's interest would turn towards nuclear physics. Edward Condon focused on the applications of new methods of quantum mechanics to problems of atomic and molecular structure, and the interpretation of radioactivity. By this point, theoretical and quantum physics had gone from obscure sciences most Americans had not heard of, to well-known sciences with broad, practical applications. In the 1930s, physicists were responsible for major advancements in radar, FM and AM radio, the first Xerox copying machines, new kinds of long-lasting batteries, and many other things, and physicists were in hot demand. Edward Condon would leave academia in 1937 to work at Westinghouse Electric and Manufacturing Company, and while there he would invent a device called the Nimitron. The Nimitron was a machine that recreated the ancient math game called NIM. This device was revealed at the 1939 New York World's Fair, and the Nimitron machine was credited with being one of the first machine games, and first examples of machine's ability to represent data. Although the Nimitron was popular at the World's Fair, it was too expensive to mass produce and sell, and with World War II looming on the horizon, Condon focused on research and development of microwave radar and nuclear physics.
Japan has brought 55,000 more troops up the Yangtze River. And as the Chinese armies mass in a great arc around the city's western outskirts, it's war within a few months.
Germany has invaded Poland and has bombed many towns. General mobilization has been ordered in Britain and France.
When World War II broke out across the globe, many of America's prominent scientists would go into research and defense. Edward Condon would help organize President Roosevelt's National Defense Research Committee, a scientific research and development effort led by Vannevar Bush. Edward Condon also helped MIT organize their infamous Rad Lab, which featured scientists like Carl Compton, Ernest Lawrence, and John Trump. In Europe, atomic physicists made another very important scientific discovery. When neutrons were bombarded against certain isotopes of the unstable elements uranium or plutonium, something interesting would occur. It was discovered that if certain unstable isotopes of uranium or plutonium were bombarded with neutrons, it would result in the breaking of the atom into multiple smaller and more stable elements. This was initially unexpected due to the extreme binding energy of the nucleus. This atomic splitting process would have a side effect of releasing a large amount of nuclear binding energy, and this process would also release stray neutrons. This process would come to be known as nuclear fission. To compare nuclear fusion and nuclear fission, as it was understood at the time, nuclear fusion is the combination of two lighter atoms or particles into larger ones. Nuclear fission occurs when bombarding certain unstable elements, like uranium or plutonium, with neutrons results in the splitting of atoms into two smaller atoms. And this process would release a noticeable amount of energy and stray neutrons. Furthermore, it was theorized that if you were able to get a large enough quantity of uranium or plutonium and attempted nuclear fission, the neutrons and energy that were released in the initial splitting of the atoms would go on to bombard nearby atoms, causing the splitting of these nearby atoms, releasing more energy and more neutrons. And this process would repeat and repeat, causing a chain reaction. And this chain reaction would release a huge amount of energy. And it was theorized that it could create an explosion bigger than any chemical reaction. One saving grace regarding this theorized superbomb was that the specific isotopes of uranium and plutonium needed for the desired fission process were very rare and extremely expensive to produce quantities that would lead to the desired result. Nevertheless, the race to an atomic bomb had begun, and American scientists watched nervously from the sidelines. Following Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor, America officially joined World War II. There was a massive mobilization effort, and all aspects of American society honed in and focused on winning the war. Amidst this climate, Edward Condon began hearing rumors amongst his scientific colleagues that a top-secret project was being organized to build off of the discovery of nuclear fission and split the atoms of uranium or plutonium to harness the power of the energy released in the chain nuclear reaction and create the theorized superbomb. And soon, these rumors would come knocking at Condon's door. J. Robert Oppenheimer, Condon's fellow Berkeley alumni, who studied with Condon in Germany, showed up and asked Condon if he would join him on a top-secret project that would come to be known as the Manhattan Project, the massive scientific project to create the first atomic bomb. The Manhattan Project composed of some 130,000 workers, various project sites around the country, and a budget of billions of dollars, and J. Robert Oppenheimer had been tasked with helping organize this effort. J. Robert Oppenheimer recruited Condon to be the associate director of Los Alamos, one of many sites around the country which were taking part in the Manhattan Project. Condon helped select the Los Alamos site in New Mexico. An interesting coincidence is found in that Los Alamos was close to Edward Condon's birthplace of Alamogordo, New Mexico. Edward Condon helped Oppenheimer select the Los Alamos staff, and Edward Condon prepared a document on nuclear physics called the Los Alamos Primer that all the new scientists at Los Alamos were to read upon arrival. Edward Condon was working as an assistant director to one of history's most seminal scientific undertakings. According to physicist Edward Teller, Condon was single-handedly responsible for shortening the length of time to the eventual H-bomb by 1 whole year. There is something else worth bringing up. In my researching Edward Condon, I was surprised to learn that he had many tangential, possible run-ins with UFOs prior to his taking the Air Force contract in the late 60s, nearly 20 years later. One example can be found in his founding of Los Alamos, and the role Los Alamos National Laboratory has played in UFO lore, as well as all of the UFO sightings reported around the various Manhattan Project sites like the Hanford site and Oak Ridge. Another interesting point to note is that the language in the 2023 NDAA seems to indicate that UFOs were spotted and perhaps recovered near the Trinity test site, where the Los Alamos scientists would eventually detonate the first atomic bomb. Now there will be a few more of these interesting brushes with UFOs that Condon would have. Nothing confirmed, but UFO history lovers will find these tidbits interesting, so just keep these in a side box going forward. The brutality of World War II, along with intelligence reports that the Germans were close to developing the atom bomb, motivated the Manhattan Project scientists to put all they had into reaching the bomb first, without much regard for the implications and effects an atomic bomb would have on the world.
I have been asked whether, in the years to come, it will be possible to kill 40 million American people in the 20 largest American towns by the use of atomic bombs in a single night. I am afraid that the answer to that question is yes.
Amidst this patriotic and urgent climate, under which the Manhattan Project scientists worked, Edward Condon would go against the grain and be one of the first American scientists to raise the question of whether civilian scientists or the military should be responsible for overseeing atomic energy. A point of contention for Edward Condon was that he did not think that the military should be the sole group responsible for this new weapon that was going to be unleashed on the world. Condon's problems would be compounded by the secrecy that the military put under the Manhattan Project scientist. Condon was angry that scientists were not allowed to consult other scientists also working on the project, which made progress difficult. Edward Condon clashed with General Leslie Groves, the Army Corps of Engineer officer overseeing the construction of the Manhattan Project. Because of these concerns, Edward Condon would resign from the Manhattan Project. In his resignation letter to Oppenheimer and the military officials overseeing the Manhattan Project, Edward Condon would say, quote, "The thing which upsets me the most is the extraordinary close security policy. I do not feel qualified to question the wisdom of this, since I am totally unaware of the extent of enemy espionage and sabotage activities. I only want to say that in my case, I found that the extreme concern with security was morbidly depressing, especially the discussion about censoring mail and telephone calls." Edward Condon's departure from the Manhattan Project in the midst of World War II was one of the first examples of scientists and the military clashing over who would control and decide how the atom and atomic energy would be used. But more scientists would come to the position of Condon once the power of the atom bomb was actually witnessed.
Correspondents at Air Headquarters on Guam, including CBS's Webley Edwards, though they could not attribute it to any specific source, were allowed to say there is reason to believe that the Japanese city of Hiroshima, approximately the size of Memphis or Seattle or Rochester, New York, no longer exists. General Spot smiled when asked if the new atomic bomb would be dropped again in the near future, but every indication is that it will be, for he announced that more B-29s are ready to follow the Pathfinder which hit Hiroshima, and that the atomic bombers would operate Air Force bases in the Marianas.
After witnessing the horrors unleashed on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, many atomic scientists began to flock to the Edward Condon camp of a need for serious addressal on the use and oversight of the atom. And because of his early departure from the Manhattan Project, Edward Condon became a scientist that other scientists sharing his sentiments flocked to. Edward Condon, along with like-minded atomic scientists like Philip Morrison and J. Robert Oppenheimer, would be instrumental in organizing civilian atomic scientists to lobby and serve as scientific advisors to congressmen with the hope of putting atomic energy in the hands of civilian scientists and not the military, now that World War II was over and the Manhattan Project was dispersed. Condon served as scientific advisor to Senator Brian McMahon, who drafted the Atomic Energy Act of 1946. This act ensured that atomic and nuclear technology in America would be managed by civilians and not the military. The Atomic Energy Act of 1946 created the United States Atomic Energy Commission, and this government organization would eventually become the Department of Energy, long suspected of UFO connections. It is interesting that Edward Condon was largely influential in the creation of the Department of Energy, another unexpected Condon UFO overlap. Edward Condon was then appointed director of the National Bureau of Standards in 1948 by President Harry Truman. What is the National Bureau of Standards? Well, when the National Bureau of Standards was founded in 1905, there are at least 8 different gallons and 4 different feet in use, and this government organization was responsible for standardizing proper measurements on these and other matters. They were also one of the government's only scientific organizations at the time, and they partook in the Manhattan Project as well. While Condon was the director of the National Bureau of Standards, the National Bureau of Standards created the world's first atomic clock. Condon's time with the National Bureau of Standards also has some unexpected UFO overlap. An associate of Condon's at the National Bureau of Standards was Harvard astronomer Dr. Donald Menzel, and during this time, Menzel was doing contract work debunking UFOs for the Air Force. Another unexpected UFO overlap during Condon's time running the National Bureau of Standards is that during Condon's tenure, Major Aaron Boggs and Captain Robert Snyder, both project officers for Project Sign, the Air Force's first public UFO investigation, gave a briefing to the National Bureau of Standards on various UFO incidents and later sent over incident summaries at the request of Colonel McCoy, who oversaw intelligence at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. We have members of Project Sign, the Air Force's first UFO investigation, briefing the National Bureau of Standards in 1948, when Edward Condon was the president and when Donald Menzel was his associate. During this time, Edward Condon also served as an advisor to the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, a precursor to NASA, and things were looking up. But soon, Condon would get caught up once again in a Red Scare. In 1948, during the McCarthy era, Dr. Edward Condon was one of many atomic scientists accused of communist sympathies. This was largely influenced by his time in the San Francisco Bay Area covering labor movements, his early departure from the Manhattan Project, his role in the creation of the Atomic Energy Commission, some of his wife's associations with suspected Soviet spies, and his participation in the American Soviet Science Society, a Rockefeller-funded international science group that Condon claims he joined out of belief that science should be beyond countries. Edward Condon was investigated by the Loyalty Review Board, and his preliminary loyalty interview was conducted by future President and then Congressman Richard Nixon. Here in these hearings lies another unexpected Condon UFO overlap. It should be noted that there are some researchers who claim that along with the anti-American and anti-communist sentiments that fueled the McCarthy hearings, there were also UFO underpinnings to these hearings when considering who was questioned and about what and during what years. This is a topic for its own video, but there is a quick Condon point that I want to highlight. This memo is referred to as the Guy Hoddle Memo. It was drafted in March 1950 by FBI agent Guy Hoddle, who was at that time the head of the Bureau's Washington field office. His report relays an account said to have been given by an Air Force investigator who claimed to have recovered a trio of flying saucers with crew intact. This document has caused quite a stir in recent years, being the most viewed file on the FBI's website, and various explanations have been concocted to explain it away. Nevertheless, this same Guy Hoddle, who wrote the March 1950 memo about crashed UFO retrievals, also wrote a majority of the reports and conducted field investigations on Edward Condon and his wife for his FBI file as a part of the Red Scare. Another interesting, unexpected UFO Condon overlap. Amidst these McCarthy investigations, Edward Condon was hauled before the House Un-American Activities Committee.
Have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? Are you a member of the Communist Party? Are you a member of the Communist Party?
Many prominent scientists would publicly support Edward Condon, including Edward Teller and Albert Einstein. Edward Condon became a rally point for the American scientific community and those wishing to see scientific freedom. Edward Condon became a symbol of scientific freedom in America, and this would be demonstrated by the American Association for the Advancement of Science. America's oldest national civilian science organization would eventually elect Condon as president. And at the 100-year centennial celebration of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, President Harry Truman gave a speech with Edward Condon and other atomic scientists that were caught up in the Red Scare seated behind him. President Truman made a point to emphasize the importance of scientific freedom and a government that promotes and cooperates with scientists.
Members of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, ladies and gentlemen, the second obligation of the federal government in connection with basic research is to provide working conditions under which scientists will be encouraged to work for the government. Scientists do not want to work in ivory towers, but they do want to work in an atmosphere free from suspicion and personal insult or politically motivated attacks. It is highly unfortunate that we have not been able to maintain the proper conditions for best scientific work. It was highlighted by a telegram I received last week from 8 distinguished scientists. These men expressed their alarm at the deterioration of the relations between scientists and the government because of the frequent attacks which have been made on scientists with the ostensible name, in the ostensible name of security.
In the 1950s, when Condon's life was getting back to normal, he was once again investigated by the House Un-American Activities Committee. This time around, J. Robert Oppenheimer was being investigated as well as their fellow Berkeley alum and atomic scientist Philip Morrison, 3 of the most prominent anti-war atomic scientists. Oppenheimer had also had connections to Berkeley communist groups through his wife and his brother, and Oppenheimer's opposition to the development of the hydrogen bomb deemed him un-American. And Philip Morrison had been a card-carrying communist. As a result of the next round of Atomic House Un-American Activities Committee hearings, Edward Condon, Philip Morrison, and J. Robert Oppenheimer would be stripped of their clearances and be unable to work on classified projects. Following the McCarthy hearings fiasco, Edward Condon would resign from the government, losing his clearances, and transition to academia and eventually the University of Colorado, where in 1966 he would take the Air Force UFO contract to study UFOs and Project Blue Book, his first official post with the government since the Oppenheimer trial. Many UFO enthusiasts felt good about the announcement of the University of Colorado and Edward Condon, hoping that his past examples of sticking to his scientific principles would carry through into this study. This project looked promising. It was to be free of Air Force or intelligence interference, and the FAA was now to forward their civilian and commercial UFO reports to the Condon Committee. The announcement of the Colorado study run by Edward Condon, combined with the new public advocacy of James McDonald and the former Air Force debunker J. Allen Hynek, completely energized the UFO community. UFO groups around the country saw surges in membership. And that year's UFO Congress was the largest on record. And J. Allen Hynek would celebrate the appointment of Condon with his family, feeling vindicated that scientists were finally the ones looking at UFOs and not the Air Force. And soon, the Condon Committee was underway.
The white star over there got really bright, a really brilliant white, and it lit up the whole field. You could see everything.
I was flying at the time I saw this U.S. so-called UFO.
Photo of it is across the road in front of me, and I simply took the camera.
The University of Colorado, a sponsor of the Condon Project, is a world-renowned center for the study of all kinds of atmospheric phenomena. Set up in November of last year, the committee was given $313,000 by the U.S. Air Force and 18 months to prepare what the Air Force hopes will be the last word on the subject of UFOs. World in Action's camera team was the first ever to be allowed to film these scenes of the committee at work. The job has turned out to be tougher than expected. Consequently, the budget is to be doubled and the time extended to 2 years. In their offices at Woodbury Hall at the university. Among the project's dozen experts are Director Dr. Edward Condon, formerly physicist with the National Bureau of Standards. Dr. Fred Ayer, nuclear physicist and head of the committee's field investigation unit. Project coordinator, Robert Lowe. Investigator, Dr. Roy Craig, physical chemist from the University of Colorado. And Mary Lou Armstrong, administrative assistant to Robert Lowe. Everyone's great hope is that someday one of the investigators will be lucky enough to see a UFO firsthand. Most of the committee's time is taken up with checking out UFO reports, where possible in person. Thousands of feet of interviews are taped on current and past sightings.
Well, that's something we worked very hard on. We not only do we want to find out, but we want to find out quickly. So
I'd say that the greatest difficulty about getting anything,
we set up all kinds of elaborate mechanisms to have people.
The thing that seems most frustrating to me as a physicist, one would like to get direct observational material oneself, that is to say photographs or spectrographs or...
If the sighting looks interesting, we'll send people at any time of the night, and so that's one of the things we work very hard at.
Or at least our own people see things. But all of the things that are reported are a very transient duration. They only last for a few minutes, and apparently as many people that do see things get so excited about it that they'll postpone till the next day before they make a report. So that in point of fact, not only have we not ourselves directly seen anything in this effort, but have merely been thereby limited simply to interviewing people.
Many amateur groups like this one have responded to Condon's appeal for help in chasing down the elusive evidence of UFOs.
I mean, one does feel frustrated and discouraged at times, but that's not the same as saying that one should give up and quit. There are some very puzzling things that need to be looked into, and...
Right now I'd like to let you all meet Mr. Bill Donovan from AIR in Poughkeepsie. That's Aerial Investigation Research Organization. So, thank you, Lonnie.
We would welcome not only better evidence about them, but also suggestions as to better ways of investigation, how to get there quicker.
Though the Condon Committee initially seemed promising, soon problems started appearing. Hynek, James McDonald, Kehoe, NICAP, and APRO would all offer to assist the project and provide any case files and insights regarding UFOs. Condon delayed and declined many of these offers, and considered civilian UFO groups' case reports useless, preferring to only use Air Force records. One staffer would later say there was not a single Project Blue Book report that Condon did not believe the Air Force completely on. And Edward Condon prided himself on only hiring people with no UFO experience on the project. During this time, the Air Force was maintaining their debunking stance.
There's nothing to hide.
There's nothing to hide at all.
Is there anything in the files, either classified or unclassified, that would indicate that there may be extraterrestrial visitors over here?
First of all, the project is completely unclassified. And there is nothing in the records which would indicate that we have been visited by any advanced civilization.
And the Air Force was supposed to have little influence on the Condon Committee.
The only involvement in Project Blue Book with the Colorado contract is to provide them duplicates of all current UFO reports and such material from our files as they may ask. Dr. Condon is conducting a totally independent study.
Despite the agreed-upon mandate that the Air Force stay hands-off of the Condon Committee, Condon would cozy up to the Air Force. And one Condon Committee staffer would say, there is not a single Project Blue Book report that Condon did not believe the Air Force completely on. And Edward Condon prided himself on only hiring people with no UFO experience on the project. Condon would take his staff to visit NORAD. At NORAD, his contact was Colonel Robert Hippler. Colonel Robert Hippler would write to Condon what the Air Force expectations of the Colorado study were. This brings us to the second item. When you have looked into some sightings and examined some Blue Book records and become acquainted with the true state of affairs, you must consider the cost of the Air Force program on UFOs and determine if the taxpayer should support this for the next decade. It will be at least that long before another independent study can be mounted to see if the Air Force can get out from under this program. If the contract is up before you have laid the proper groundwork for a proper recommendation, an extension of the contract would be less costly than another decade of operating Project Blue Book. This memo indicates that the Air Force expected Condon to dismiss UFOs. Behind the scenes, Air Force Regulation 200-2 was replaced with AFR 80-17, which orders members of the military who investigate UFO reports to release information if there was an explanation, but if there is none, to withhold the information, even from the Colorado Project. These initial red flags were largely unknown to the public at the time, but soon Condon would make public statements that drew doubts on the Colorado UFO study. In January of 1967, Condon publicly stated, "It is my inclination right now to recommend that the government get out of this business. My attitude right now is that there is nothing to it. But I'm not supposed to reach that conclusion for another year." This statement by Condon, and the stonewalling when being offered assistance by ufologists, angered James McDonald. And to put pressure on the Condon Committee, McDonald began publicly speaking about the CIA's Robertson Panel and their role in the UFO cover-up. And remember, this was a time when the Robertson Panel was not common knowledge, and many Americans viewed Project Blue Book as a thorough scientific investigation.
Why has the government taken this attitude, in your opinion?
It's not a brief story, but it goes back to 1953 when a CIA-involved investigation was held. As a result of the extremely heavy wave of sightings in 1952, the CIA and Air Force became so concerned over the sheer number of reports that were tying up American intelligence channels that they wanted to get this signal out of the system, asked the Air Force, the CIA asked the Air Force for a debunking policy. The literal wording was to debunk the flying saucers, to decrease public interest in the UFOs. Regulations were promulgated very shortly that made it a crime punishable with, I think it's $10,000 fine and or 10 years in prison to release any information at airbase level on UFOs. And as a result of that, in a sequence of steady downgrading, the whole problem has been essentially lost from scientific sight in the U.S., and nothing resembling any scientific investigation has been going on in the past 15 years.
Has this been typical of the attitude of most world governments?
As nearly as I can tell, yes. There seems to be quite surprising similarity between the official Russian, British, Australian, Canadian, American, French, Italian pronouncements. They all seem to take the view that there's nothing to it, that there's a lot of nonsense, that people see things, and that it is not a real scientific problem at all, and I most heartily disagree with that. We have in the UFO problem a very strange situation here for 20 years plus. Essentially similar phenomena have been reported all over the world, large numbers in the U.S., officialdom ignoring them, Air Forces ignoring them, and yet apparently a steady increase in the numbers of reliable reports from people in all walks of life seeing these objects that are not products of our technology, they're not meteorological astronomical phenomena, hovering at low altitude, increasing numbers in urban areas, and collectively we don't know what's going on. That's an extremely unwise situation, no matter how you view it. We do not know what is involved in this problem. There are no strong indications of anything resembling hostility. I see some faint indications of hazard and danger, but in general, to have this possibility that the world is under something resembling reconnaissance, possibly from some extraterrestrial source, and to go on about our petty ways collectively doesn't seem to me to be a wise situation. So I'm trying to get scientists and governmental agencies to take a look at this at a highly accelerated pace.
Professor McDonald, thank you very much.
During 1967, James McDonald would also take his UFO advocacy abroad, visiting Australia, and James McDonald was also invited to speak at the United Nations. Then Secretary General Hugh Thant was particularly sympathetic to UFOs, and this speech by McDonald would be the first attempt at seriously addressing UFOs at the United Nations. McDonald's newly amplified public advocacy would come at a cost, as he soon became the target of a young UFO debunker. Philip Klass was the senior avionics editor for Aviation Week and Space Technology magazine. In his personal life, he was a big US Civil War buff. And in the world of UFOs, he would go on to become one of the largest UFO debunkers of the second half of the 20th century.
We've had tens of thousands of UFO reports, yet there is not a single photograph of an extraordinary craft-like object that cannot be explained as a hoax or in other prosaic terms.
Nevertheless, in 1967, Philip Klass would have his first foray onto the UFO scene, and his eyes were set on James McDonald. Philip Klass's initial correspondence with James McDonald was friendly, but it would soon turn to constant attacks and vitriol. He would publicly challenge McDonald and his claims at every chance he could get, and Philip Klass would write McDonald's superiors at the University of Arizona letters stating that McDonald was unfit to be a professor and should be fired from the university. Fortunately, the University of Arizona continued to support McDonald. Philip Klass then wrote the Navy, from the point of view of a concerned taxpayer, that James McDonald was misappropriating his research funds chasing UFOs. And because of Klass's letter-writing campaigns, James McDonald would lose his Navy funding. Philip Klass was one of many prominent UFO debunkers that could be found in the late 1960s, during the Condon Committee years. Another prominent UFO debunker during the Condon years was Dr. Donald Menzel, one of America's first public UFO debunkers and an associate of Project Blue Book for nearly as long as Hynek.
I don't think you'll ever clear the air to the satisfaction, at least, of the UFO buffs. They want to believe, they're happy believing, let them go on believing. I think it's a great waste of time and money to spend much more time investigating it.
Diametrically opposed to Dr. McDonald's views is Dr. Donald Menzel, astronomer with the Harvard College Observatory at Cambridge, Massachusetts. He has made a personal crusade of debunking UFO sightings.
To go on for year after year trying to prove whether or not these things come from outer space or not. It's clear that they don't, and I'm quite sure that that will be the result of any investigation.
Another prominent debunker during the Condon years was Thornton Page. Thornton Page was an original member of the CIA's Robertson panel back in 1953. And Thornton Page had been debunking UFOs with the Air Force ever since.
Astronomer Thornton Page was on a CIA committee that investigated UFO reports in 1952. Its conclusion? No evidence of UFOs.
Our panel was expected to be, and I think was, objective in its approach, and tried to evaluate all the reports without saying they're ridiculous in advance.
A young astronomer, Carl Sagan, would appear on the UFO scene during this time as well, and he would go on to become one of the leading national UFO debunkers.
I and a few of my colleagues have spent a fair amount of time trying to find some evidence for intelligent life on Earth. By and large, we've been unsuccessful.
There's not a single verified or checked out report which is at all connectable with the possibility of extraterrestrial life.
Carl Sagan was born in Brooklyn, New York on November 9, 1934. His interest in science began when he was 5, when his parents took him to the 1939 New York World's Fair.
Welcome to the future and all the wonders of the 21st century in the greatest preview the world has ever seen.
Take away ahead, look at tomorrow, just as if you were there.
For 6 wonderful months.
Pack up your family and head for the fair.
As he walked through the various exhibits and saw the inventions present, something clicked in him, and he began a lifelong affection for science. And soon, a young Sagan was constantly going to the library, checking out books about the sun, planets, and the solar system, and he also began going to museums alone as a child as well. Carl Sagan graduated high school at 16 and immediately went to the University of Chicago, where he earned a degree in physics. Interestingly, Carl Sagan had an interest in UFOs spurred on by the 1952 wave. He would often write about UFOs and ET life in his journals. And a then 17-year-old college student, Carl Sagan even wrote a letter to the Secretary of State asking about US policy regarding ETs. And Carl Sagan would debate his scientific mentor, Herman Muller, about UFOs being aliens often. Carl Sagan then went on to earn PhDs in astronomy and astrophysics from UC Berkeley. And he would become a consultant to RAND and on various NASA projects. He worked on NASA's Mariner 2, which sent a probe to study Venus.
Even more astounding news from the far reaches of space comes from Mariner 2, which roared off last August for its rendezvous with Venus, 36 million miles and thousands of hours.
And about this time, the mid to late 1960s, is when Carl Sagan would become a prominent UFO debunker. It should be noted, many in the UFO community allege that Sagan knew that there was truth to UFOs, but was an intelligence asset that played the role of downplaying the issue for the public. Let's examine some of the basis for these claims. An interesting fact about Sagan is that one of his first interactions being a scientific consultant for the Air Force came in 1958 when he participated in a top-secret project called Project A119. Project A119 was an Air Force project based out of Kirkland Air Force Base in New Mexico, and the project aim was to detonate a nuclear weapon on the moon, all in an effort to boost morale in the space race as the Soviets had just launched Sputnik. Carl Sagan was a scientific consultant to Project A119, and he was on the team tasked with predicting the effects of the nuclear explosion in space and on the moon. Ultimately, A119, the plan to detonate a nuclear weapon on the moon, was not carried out. I find Sagan's involvement with Project A119 interesting for two reasons. Firstly, Project A119, as well as Carl Sagan's involvement in it, were not public knowledge until the year 2000, after Sagan had died, and this project is still not officially acknowledged by the Air Force. This demonstrates that Sagan was able to keep classified programs he was involved with a secret for life. I also find his involvement in Project A119 interesting, in that Project A119, the plan to detonate a nuclear weapon on the moon, sounds similar to Starfish Prime, a high-altitude nuclear weapons test that actually did take place in 1962, 4 years after the scrapped Project A119. And Starfish Prime has become a large part of UFO lore in recent years. Project A119, the plan to detonate a nuclear weapon on the moon, sounds like it might contain UFO briefings, given UFO interest in our nuclear weapons and the similarity to Starfish Prime. And right around that time, in the late 1950s, is when Carl Sagan's views on UFOs would change from enthusiast to skeptic debunker. Another interesting point to note is that Sagan's doctoral mentor, Gerard Cooper, for whom the Cooper Belt is named after, was an ardent UFO skeptic. Originally, Cooper had had his own UFO sighting, but after being acquainted with the likes of George Adamski, he decided that they were all nonsense. Gerard Cooper also had several contracts with the CIA to probe Soviet scientific knowledge. And like his doctoral mentor, Carl Sagan would find himself in the middle of intelligence operations of the Cold War. Sagan recounts multiple times in which scientific coalitions would be set up for him by the Air Force. And an enthusiastic young Sagan, eager to share scientific ideas, would learn after the fact that the entire meeting was set up by the Air Force and the CIA to probe Soviet knowledge. Sagan recounts that he was naive and felt used by these interactions. In 1961, Carl Sagan would be called upon to be a state witness in the trial of Reinhold Schmidt. Schmidt claimed to be a UFO contactee, and he was being tried for scamming elderly women into buying crystals. Sagan testified on behalf of the state that Saturn was uninhabitable, making the claimed contactee's story impossible. That same year, 1961, Carl Sagan was present at a National Academy of Sciences organized conference at the Green Bank Observatory, the largest telescope in the field of radio astronomy. The purpose of this conference was exploring the ways to search for extraterrestrial life. And present at this conference were many interesting scientists. Among them were Frank Drake, and this is where Frank Drake first presented his infamous Drake equation, an equation used to estimate the number of civilizations in the Milky Way galaxy. Also present was Philip Morrison, a Berkeley atomic physicist and the Manhattan Project scientist who helped organize the Atomic Energy Commission with Condon and Oppenheimer, and who was also investigated by the House Un-American Activities Committee. Philip Morrison was also an early advocate of using microwave radios to search for aliens in space. Another attendee was astrophysicist Su Shua Huang, who coined the term the habitable zone. And another interesting attendee was John C. Lilly, who invented sensory deprivation tanks, and who was also attempting to devise a way to communicate with dolphins. In honor of Lilly's dolphin work, the scientists present at this conference would name themselves the Order of the Dolphin. And from this conference, SETI, or the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, would be born.
We're seeking the answers of those questions every human being asks himself at one time. Why am I here? Why is there a world? We will never understand these things until we have understood the birth and death of the stars, where life comes from, what forms it can take, What is its eventual destiny? What you see here is by far the largest radio telescope in the world. It's a reflecting telescope with a reflector 1,000 feet in diameter. Now this means that it has a collecting area for signals from space equal in size to about 20 acres, about equal to the combined collecting areas of all the other optical and radio telescopes of the Earth. The towers you see are higher than the Washington Monument, and the structure you see high in the air, 50 stories in the air, is larger than a football field. This is what it takes to reach to the very depths of space and to see the faint signals that come to us and tell us what processes are going on out there and what may happen in the future.
And while the stated goals of SETI should be admired, they were undertaken with the predisposition that there was nothing to earthly UFO reports. And Carl Sagan was there while SETI was forming. In 1966, Carl Sagan released his first UFO debunking book titled Intelligent Life in the Universe. This book was co-released with the Soviet astronomer Josef Shklovsky. In this book, Carl Sagan recounts many tales of contactees and his own role in the Reinhold Schmidt trial. And with this book, Carl Sagan was now a public debunker on the national stage. Now on to Carl Sagan's more concrete connections to UFOs through his association with Project Blue Book. Carl Sagan was an associate of Air Force debunker Donald Menzel, and Donald Menzel personally invited Sagan to Harvard University, where Sagan would spend many years. Carl Sagan was also an associate of CIA Robertson panel member Thornton Page, and Sagan was invited to participate in the CBS Michigan UFO debunking documentary by Thornton Page.
Talking with Carl Sagan here because he's in the same position that I was, being the only astronomer in a similar panel.
There's not a single verified or checked out report which is at all connectable with the possibility of extraterrestrial life. If you would believe, as the flying saucer cultists would have us believe, that the majority of the saucer reports are due to visitations, then you have a very strange situation. Science, for good or for ill, has destroyed a lot of the traditional theologies. And yet people have the same needs to believe that they always did, perhaps more so because of the times we live in. Well, the flying saucer myths are a really clever compromise. It's a way of having beings that come from the sky, that are worried about us, that are powerful, that are going to step in and prevent us from destroying ourselves, as we very well might, and yet have it in the cloak of science, so that no one can say nonsense that doesn't match science. It's all very pseudo-scientific. I would think that at least for the contact myths and probably for a lot of the events of people who just see things they don't understand flying overhead, that what's involved psychology and theology and not so much the physical sciences.
And Carl Sagan would also release a UFO debunking book with CIA Robertson panel member Thornton Page. Carl Sagan soon became a frequent scientific consultant to Project Blue Book, like Hynek once was. Sagan had served on the O'Brien panel, convened by the Air Force following the Michigan wave, and this was the panel that was mentioned during the congressional hearing by the Secretary of the Air Force, Harold D. Brown. In many ways, Carl Sagan was the successor to J. Allen Hynek in Project Blue Book. Both were scientific advisors to the Air Force and public debunkers. Before Hynek's departure from Project Blue Book, if the public was to hear a prominent scientist on TV debunking and downplaying UFOs, they were likely to hear J. Allen Hynek, Donald Menzel, and Thornton Page. And after Hynek's departure from Blue Book, Carl Sagan would take his place in this lineup. And here is what J. Allen Hynek had to say about Carl Sagan.
Dr. Sagan, when asked the question, are UFOs for real, he said, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And I do not see, my colleagues do not see, and specifically physical evidence to document.
You and your colleagues, and Sagan particularly, have not studied it. Sagan and I were at Harvard together, and we were talking about UFOs. He, of course, poo-pooed it. And I said, well, what do you think about the Homer, New York case? Never heard of it. What do you think of the Monticello, Wisconsin case? Never heard of it. And I went down the line, case after case after case. You'd never heard of him, never studied him. And I said, Carl, darn it, you know as well as I do that for a scientist, he speaks on something, he should be familiar with the literature, he should have studied it. I said, yeah, he says, but I don't have time for that sort of stuff.
There are some indications that the CIA was actively involved with UFOs during the Condon Committee years, so let's examine some of these allegations. The second in command of the Colorado Project, directly behind Dr. Condon, was Dr. Robert Lowe, a hardened skeptic, and according to some UFO researchers, he had been in the CIA prior to teaching at the University of Colorado. CIA officers were reported alongside some of the Condon Committee field investigations, and Edward Condon and some of his staff made attempts at probing Soviet information through a cooperative investigation effort. A big indicator of CIA involvement would come from the Condon Committee's relationship with the CIA's photo analyst. The Condon Committee would visit the CIA National Photographic Center to meet with CIA photo reconnaissance analyst Arthur C. Lundahl, famous for discovering the Soviet missile installations in Cuba that led to the Cuban Missile Crisis.
At its beginning, this day looked as though it might be one of armed conflict between Soviet vessels and American warships on the sea lanes leading to Cuba.
Arthur Lundahl also has some interesting history regarding UFOs. He had been the Navy photo analyst for the original Tremonton films back in 1952. His analysis was presented and then rejected at the Robertson panel.
The Utah film had already been subjected to some 1,000 or so man-hours of analysis by the Navy's Photographic Interpretation Laboratory. Now, the Navy had, on the basis of their detailed analysis of the Utah films, they had concluded that the objects shown in the films could not be birds, balloons, aircraft, and so forth, but indeed that they were self-luminous, unidentified objects. Despite this conclusion, the panel rejected it and concluded that the objects were birds. They couldn't be unidentified, therefore they had to be birds.
Some UFO researchers allege that Arthur Lundahl was quite involved with the UFO issue once he transferred to the CIA. Upon meeting with Arthur C. Lundahl, a relationship was established in which the CIA's NPIC would assist the Condon Committee in photo analysis of UFOs. This cooperation was hidden from the public, as the Condon Committee was supposed to be an independent scientific study free of military or intelligence influence. And a memo dated February 23, 1967, confirms the secret nature of this relationship, stating, "Any work performed by NPIC to assist Dr. Condon in his investigation will not be identified as work accomplished by the CIA. Dr. Condon was advised by Mr. Lundahl to make no reference to the CIA in regard to this work effort. Dr. Condon stated that if he felt it necessary to obtain an official CIA comment, he would make a separate distinct entry into the CIA not related to contacts he has with the NPIC." And Arthur Lundahl, Edward Condon, Robert Lowe, and Carl Sagan made attempts at probing Soviet information through a cooperative investigation effort, another example of scientists being used as intelligence assets during the Cold War. The Soviets declined the offer. Another CIA UFO interference allegation would be that the CIA was actively trying to disrupt NICAP, the UFO organization run by Donald Keyhoe, America's first UFO researcher.
NICAP's director, Major Donald E. Keyhoe, a retired Marine Corps officer, insisted that the Air Force knew more than it was telling.
It has reached to the point where many people in the Air Force have the same conclusion. In fact, the Air Force at one time had a top secret estimate that these things were interplanetary spaceships. So you will see that this, instead of being a subject for ridicule and a big joke, actually is a serious matter which could affect the lives of all of us.
And these claims stem from NICAP's internal turmoil. Donald Keyhoe's leadership was being actively challenged during this time, and one of the biggest proponents for Keyhoe's removal was NICAP member Joseph Bryan. Joseph Bryan joined NICAP in the late 1950s. He introduced himself to Keyhoe as formerly Air Force, but Joseph Bryan's resume was much more elaborate. Joseph Bryan began his career as a journalist and writer. He then went on to join the military. Joseph Bryan holds the distinction of having served in 3 branches of the military. He served in the Army after college. During World War II, he served in naval intelligence. And after that, he would become a colonel in the Air Force. Following his time with the Air Force, he would then go on to join the CIA and was one of the founders and highest-ranking members of the CIA's Psychological Warfare Unit. He was instrumental in the CIA getting the rights to George Orwell's Animal Farm. and Colonel Joseph Bryant seems to have been involved with the CIA project, Project Artichoke, a precursor to MK Ultra. Needless to say, Colonel Joseph Bryant's resume was more elaborate than just formerly Air Force, and this initial lying is a red flag. It is unclear if he was sent to disrupt NICAP. Some claim that Bryant was a true believer, others claim he was sent to disrupt. Nevertheless, Bryant soon began circulating memos criticizing Kehoe's leadership, and to be fair, Kehoe was not good with managing money, and NICAP had CIA officers amongst its ranks before. Along with the strife being generated towards Donald Kehoe, CIA officers also probed NICAP Vice President Richard Hall, asking for NICAP UFO case files. Something else worth noting is that in 1967, former CIA Information Warfare Officer Generoso Pope Jr., who is now the owner of the National Enquirer, would receive the contract to make the National Enquirer the first tabloid to be carried in every grocery store nationwide. And that year, the National Enquirer increased its UFO coverage, launching an additional paper that focused strictly on UFOs, World News Daily. And the National Enquirer began covering some of ufology's favorite cases that the Condon Committee was ignoring, like this one.
Bob Salas is a former captain, U.S. Air Force Base. At the U.S. Air Force. He was at Malmstrom Air Force Base in 1967, where there were claims a UFO caused missiles to malfunction.
1967, I was on duty as a missile launch officer. I get calls from my guards upstairs. First, I get one call saying that they're seeing strange lights flying in the sky, and I didn't pay too much attention to that. About 5 minutes later, the main security guard, the flight security controller, calls down, says he's looking at a glowing red object, very large, hovering over the front gate. He wants to know what to do. I tell him to secure the facility. We hang up. I go to tell my commanders. So within seconds of that call, my missiles start shutting down. I recall losing all 10 of them.
You didn't see the object?
I didn't see the object because I was obliged to stay underground in the capsule.
By shutting down, we mean what?
By shutting down, what I mean is they were not launchable. They were in a no-go condition.
What did you make of the story?
Well, I know that it's true. I went into job control after I got to the hangar. I was called in, went to the hangar, went to the job control, and I noticed they have a map of the whole complex with green lights where the missiles are good, but there's one small area with 10 red lights. I mean, those missiles were out.
Is it possible they just malfunctioned?
That doesn't happen. Very rarely does a missile malfunction, and I don't think much more rare would be 2 at the same time, but never 10.
I would like to make a comment real quick. The Air Force has perpetrated a fraud, especially in our case. They claim in their statement about UFOs that no UFO incident has ever affected national security, and we lost 20 missiles during the Cold War. They also stonewalled the Condon Committee at that time. The Condon Committee had heard about our incident and were told to go away. They said they were told that no UFOs were involved.
As the Condon Committee continued their investigations, some of the members were becoming disappointed in Condon's attitude and disregard for proper science, and these pent-up issues would soon reach a boiling point. Dr. David R. Saunders was a professor of psychology at the University of Colorado, and his role in the Condon Committee was establishing a computer database of UFO reports called the UFO Cat. Dr. David R. Saunders was also one of the only true believers to sneak onto the Condon Committee. In 1967, David R. Saunders discovered a 1966 memo from senior committee official Robert Lowe, alleged CIA asset, that Condon believed UFOs had no basis in reality, and outlining the project goals when university officials were in the early stages of talks. The 1967 memo states, quote, "The trick would be, I think, to describe the project so that to the public it would appear a totally objective study, but to the scientific community would present the image of a group of non-believers trying their best to be objective, but having an almost zero expectation of finding a saucer." David Saunders and other committee staffers were appalled by this memo, now referred to as the Trick Memo. The Trick Memo indicated that the Condon Committee's conclusions were already made before the investigation began. Unsure of what to do and seeking advice, David Saunders leaked the memo to James McDonald, J. Allen Hynek, and to Donald Keyhoe. Saunders did not want to make this memo public, yet James McDonald and Keyhoe leaked it to the press, and it was the main story in the May 1968 issue of Look magazine. The release of this memo and the Look magazine article soon caused a surge of media coverage. APRO, NICAP, McDonald, and others publicly withdrew the remaining support that they had for the Condon Committee, and now unabashedly accused them of a cover-up. Edward Condon was furious and immediately fired David R. Saunders from the project, as well as Dr. Norm Levine, who had helped get the memo to Keyhoe and McDonald. The immediate firing of Saunders and Levine prompted the resignation of many members also dissatisfied with the committee's unscientific approach. Among them was Robert Lowe's own personal assistant, Mary Lou Armstrong. And upon her departure, Mary Lou Armstrong told Condon that the staff has no confidence in Robert Lowe as a project coordinator, and that Lowe has no interest in UFO sightings or reports. When all was said and done, over half of the original Condon Committee staff was replaced. In face of all the negative coverage, Edward Condon mandated that no one on his committee or anyone representing the University of Colorado speak to the press, and they acted like nothing had happened. The trick memo was confirmation for many in the UFO community of what had already been suspected. This investigation was not scientific and was predestined to dismiss UFOs. James McDonald and NICAP engaged in a national letter-writing campaign, and thousands of UFO enthusiasts wrote their elected officials describing the Lowe memo scandal. Our friend, Robert Barrow, even wrote then-Senator Robert Kennedy and got a reply. Hynek and McDonald even lobbied President Lyndon Johnson. Johnson's aides told Hynek that they had confidence in the Condon Committee, and President Johnson then had his space technology advisor, Frank Rand, make a quiet in-house study of UFOs to, quote, get McDonald off my back. The letter-writing campaigns of McDonald and NICAP were working. Indiana Congressman J. Edward Roush was particularly sympathetic to the trick memo scandal, stating, there is a strong indication that the Colorado project will be known as the $500,000 fiasco. At the very least, grave doubts have arisen as to the scientific profundity and objectivity of the Colorado project. And soon, the letter-writing campaigns would lead to the second congressional hearings on UFOs.
In 1968, Congressman J. Edward Roush of Indiana chaired the House Committee on Sciences and Astronautics Symposium on UFOs. Congressman, do you believe UFOs are somebody else's spacecraft?
Well, I hesitate in answering the question only because of this. I don't know, but my imagination tells me that perhaps, just perhaps, there is something that would permit a man to travel faster than light. Perhaps there is something that would permit an intelligent form of life from another planet revolving around another star to make that long trip.
The Committee on Science and Astronautics held a UFO symposium on July 29, 1968. Scientists spoke on both sides of the UFO aisle, among them James McDonald, J. Allen Hynek, and Carl Sagan. And other scientists wrote in prepared statements that were read at the symposium, among them Dr. Donald Menzel, Leo Sprinkle, and a young Stanton Friedman. And NICAP prepared reports for congressmen detailing UFO reports over the past decade. The hearing would end with no real concrete stipulations added to the Condon Committee. And this second UFO congressional hearing would be the last UFO hearing for over 50 years. In January of 1969, after nearly 2 years of study and multiple scandals, the Condon Committee released their report on UFOs. Some conclusions of the report are: Condon says that a UFO cover-up is unthinkable because no one could keep such a secret for so long. Condon refutes the claim that the CIA has installed an agent within the project. Condon disapproves of UFO amateurists, especially NICAP. Condon rejects the extraterrestrial hypothesis because it is so unlikely that aliens can get from here to there. And despite 30% of the cases remaining unexplained, Condon would maintain that there was nothing to UFOs. And most damning of all, Condon recommends that the Air Force close Project Blue Book, stating, "Our general conclusion is that nothing has come from the study of UFOs in the past 21 years that has added to scientific knowledge. Careful consideration of the record, as it is available to us, leads us to conclude that further extensive study of UFOs probably cannot be justified in the expectation that science will be advanced thereby." Immediately after the release of the Condon Committee report, Donald Keyhoe, David Saunders, who leaked the trick memo, Richard Hall, and James McDonald held a press conference.
Well, I identified myself as the director of the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, which for 12 years has been carrying on a private research into UFOs with the intention of trying to get the facts and present them to Congress, the press, and the public. And then a little later I'll have Dr. David Saunders here, who was formerly on the project, one of the two who was fired for opposing Dr. Condon's supposedly negative and biased approach. And Dr. James McDonald from the University of Arizona, there at the end of the table, who for 2 years or more has been making an extensive investigation into UFOs under a special grant. He's probably the best informed scientist in the United States on this subject. Mr. Richard Hall next to him is a research consultant for NICAP. Now, we find this Condon report incredible. I'm sorry that we have to challenge it because we had hoped that this would be a very successful investigation and would really bring out some fruitful results. I'll admit that I personally was dubious at the start, but we did all we could to help them. Now, there are contradictions in this report. They state at the beginning that all the evidence is negative. There is no evidence indicating any reality of UFOs as devices under intelligent control. However, in the report itself, you will find numerous cases which say that apparently the object in there was real, and it looks as though it could be a UFO.
I feel that over a period of time, a couple of years now, that I have been in a position to look at some of the evidence, and certainly I have not seen all of the evidence that might be pertinent. I too have been driven in the direction of recognizing that there are cases that are not explainable in conventional terms. This at least leaves us with the existence of a real UFO. Beyond that, there is the question of whether some of these real UFOs may be under intelligent control. Again, at the present time, I would say that I have seen evidence that is readily interpretable in such terms, but which may also be susceptible of other interpretation. The believer is someone who accepts the idea that there are real UFOs and directs his attention to the question, why are they here? What are they doing? What do they want from us? What are their motivations? There is the assumption of intelligence or intelligent control.
A list of 50 cases which we gave to the University of Colorado on November 28, 1966 in our initial conference. They had requested such information. And
only yesterday, we've only had something like 10 or 12 hours to study these many pages, but it began to hit me that Dr. Condon has apparently not read his own material very carefully, and that would again, I'm afraid, be consistent with his general remoteness from what really went on in the project. I say that because when we tallied first of all, the 59 major cases numbered and identified in the report, we found that the percentage of unexplained cases with which the Condon Committee is left at the end of their scrutiny is 5 to 6 times larger than the percentage of unexplaineds that Project Blue Book, Air Force Project Blue Book, has been talking about for the last 10 years. But giving Dr. Condon this assignment, and he goes through the whole thing, and you do an actual tabulation, which he doesn't seem to have done, and you find his percentage of unexplaineds is 5 to 6 times larger than the Air Force, and yet what is his principal recommendation? The principal recommendation that Dr. Condon has come through with is there's nothing of scientific interest that warrants further attention on the part of the federal government here in any major way. He recommends dropping the whole problem. I think that's an important point.
Now, ridicule has been a very unfortunate factor in this thing. I know, but what it boils down to, that anybody reports one now, they'll say, you're crazy, look what the Condon report said. Now, if we let the Condon report go unchallenged, we would be guilty of letting these people be victimized. And there are many people who have been badly hurt by official ridicule after sighting. The airline pilots today, most of them will not report a sighting publicly.
Looked at their files, interviewed now about 400 or 500 witnesses, have been at it a couple of years, and I am one scientist who has been forced farther and farther to the position that the extraterrestrial hypothesis, but I underscore that word hypothesis, is the most probable hypothesis. I'm ready to throw it over when I see something that categorically rules it out, but this is my position.
Following the release of the Condon report, the pro-UFO elements in the country would continue advocating for UFOs to be seriously addressed by society. Now clear that Edward Condon and the Colorado study would not bring about a scientific revolution on UFOs, there are few options left. James McDonald and J. Allen Hynek would have to plead the case for UFOs in front of the ultimate scientific establishment in America. But what exactly is the American scientific establishment? Who decides what is science and what is pseudoscience in America? In the United States, two of the most prominent and influential scientific organizations are the American Association for the Advancement of Science and the National Academy of Sciences. These groups are largely influential in what is considered legitimate science and what is considered pseudoscience in America, and these two groups together compose what can be called the American scientific establishment, and they were the last organizations that could exert scientific authority over the Condon Report and the Air Force on whether UFOs were deserving of scientific study. We must understand these two groups, their history, and their influence if we want to understand the relationship between the American scientific community and UFOs. The first organization we will examine is the American Association for the Advancement of Science, or AAAS. Founded in Philadelphia in 1848, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, or AAAS, was the first permanent U.S. organization to promote the development of science and engineering at a national level, and this status, as the oldest national scientific organization in America, grants it immense influence. The stated goals of the AAAS are, quote, promoting cooperation among scientists, defending scientific freedom, encouraging scientific responsibility, and supporting scientific education and science outreach for the betterment of all humanity. The AAAS consists of member scientists from many different fields and universities, and AAAS members fall into two tiers: regular members and elected fellows. Any scientist in the country can join and become a regular member, but there were only a limited number of elected fellows, and being voted as one was a prestigious honor. One of the most important activities of the AAAS is their annual conference, in which scientists from all over the country would convene from diverse disciplines to present their most recent discoveries and discuss their concerns. The AAAS annual conference would become a mainstay of the American scientific community and would feature many important moments in the history of science in America. At the 1879 AAAS conference, Thomas Edison first revealed some of the key mechanisms of the light bulb to the scientific community. At the 1880 AAAS conference, Alexander Graham Bell presented his research and creation into the photophone, a precursor of the telephone, which transmits sound by light, and he also credited Mr. A.C. Brown's research into this field as well. At the 1929 AAAS conference, famed astronomer Edwin Hubble presented his paper on the expanding universe theory and the discovery of other galaxies. And at the 1934 AAAS conference, Albert Einstein would lecture for the first time before a U.S. audience. Many important and historic moments in science history have happened at the AAAS annual conference. Another very important activity of the AAAS is the publication of their scientific journal titled Science. This journal is one of the premier scientific journals in the world and still runs today. It allows scientists to publish their findings for other members of the scientific community to review. The AAAS also play a significant role in shaping scientific policy. Though separate from the government, the AAAS are politically active. The AAAS is headquartered in DC, and its member scientists would partake in lobbying efforts. And the AAAS has programs that place its members on various government agencies like the State Department and on various congressional committees. And the AAAS would serve as a conduit of funds to different research projects across the country. As time would go on, the AAAS would have over 275 affiliate organizations, like the American Medical Association, the American Dental Association, the American Psychiatric Association, and many others. And if the AAAS rejected affiliate status to an organization, discipline would be deemed pseudoscience. The AAAS and their affiliate organizations would produce educational programs, first on the radio and then later on television. They created many TV programs designed to teach scientific concepts in the hopes of stimulating scientific understanding and development. That was a brief history of the AAAS. The next organization we need to understand is the National Academy of Sciences. The National Academy of Sciences is another prominent and influential scientific organization in the United States, and its founding can be traced back to the Civil War. During the Civil War, the federal government wanted to create a centralized scientific organization to be consulted by the government in matters of science and technology, and thus Congress created the National Academy of Sciences, or NAS, to serve the purpose of being the scientific organization for policymakers to use when needed. Unlike the AAAS, which was created by civilian scientists, the NAS was created by the government. The National Academy of Sciences Charter was signed by President Abraham Lincoln in 1863 and states, quote, "The Academy shall, whenever called upon by any department of the government, investigate, examine, experiment, and report upon any subject of science or art." One of the first assignments the federal government tasked the NAS was to create a compass that worked on the newly invented ironclad ships, as the iron of these ships interfered with compasses used on traditional sailboats. The NAS has been tasked with assessing forestry lands and helping establish the national park system. And President Woodrow Wilson called upon the NAS to assess U.S. military preparedness during World War I. The National Academy of Sciences has a set limit on number of members, making it more exclusive than the AAAS. And the National Academy of Sciences would also publish a journal entitled The Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Over time, the National Academy of Sciences would form a couple affiliate groups like the National Academy of Medicine, the National Academy of Engineering, and the National Research Council, all with similar goals of being tools for policymakers. The American Association for the Advancement of Science, the first national scientific organization founded by civilian scientists and having their historic annual science conferences and the publication of their journal, Science, and the National Academy of Sciences, founded by Congress during the Civil War as a scientific institution to serve policymakers. These two groups and their many affiliate organizations are the pillars of the American scientific community, with immense authority as to what is deemed science and what is deemed pseudoscience in America. The American Association for the Advancement of Science and the National Academy of Sciences have both accomplished amazing scientific feats over the years, but it is important to note that these organizations are not infallible and have admitted fault and reversed stances previously held as fact. An example of this can be found in the role that these two groups played in the promotion of eugenics. By studying the history of the AAAS, the NAS, and eugenics, we will be able to see the mechanisms by which the scientific establishment operates and influences policy. And by studying these groups and their history of embracing and then abandoning eugenics, we will also get to see that the American scientific establishment can change the status quo on a subject once considered scientific fact. The modern-day eugenics movement would begin appearing after the publication of Charles Darwin's The Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection in 1859. Drawing from his observations of plant and animal life during his voyages to South America, Australia, and the Galapagos Islands, This seminal work would introduce evolutionary biology and natural selection to the world. And Darwin's theories rattled the scientific and religious communities. In the late 1800s, Darwin's cousin, Francis Galton, wanted to take Darwin's theories of natural selection and evolution and apply them to humans by choice in what would become to be known as eugenics. Eugenics was described at the time by its proponents as humanity taking control of its own evolutionary future through selective breeding to reduce populations that were deemed unfit. As the 20th century would come around, the American eugenics movement would take root and receive the financial backing of the Rockefeller Foundation and the Carnegie Institution. The American eugenics movement soon began growing exponentially. Charles Davenport, Harry Laughlin, Madison Grant, and Henry Osborn were some of the most prominent advocates of eugenics. And they were also distinguished fellows of both the American Association for the Advancement of Science and the National Academy of Sciences. And in 1928, Henry Osborn was elected to president of the AAAS. Many eugenicists sat on the AAAS Journal on Science's board, and they began publishing eugenics articles and prominently promoting eugenics conferences. Eugenics policies were supported by many of the scientists comprising of the NAS and the AAAS by the 1920s. They believed that they could rid society of poverty, deafness, blindness, promiscuity, alcoholism, and many other things through eugenics. And these sentiments had strong racial undertones, with an emphasis on maintaining the Anglo-Saxon racial stock of the United States. We know with hindsight that many of these characteristics could not be bred out, and that many of these characteristics that eugenicists sought to eliminate were based on subjective views on who deserves to live and who deserves to reproduce. This subjective nature makes their view of eugenics more of an ideology than a concrete science. Nevertheless, by the 1920s, the AAAS and the NAS were all in on eugenics. To hamper anti-eugenics dissent, the AAAS created a committee specifically to develop the best methods of combating anti-evolution propaganda, as anti-eugenics was deemed anti-science and anti-progress. New terms were added to the scientific lexicon, like feeble-mindedness and imbecile. And many AAAS and NAS scientists were eugenics advisors to various congressional committees, and they served as consultants and gave testimonies during seminal Supreme Court cases like the Scopes Monkey Trial and Buck v. Bell, which set the precedent that states may conduct forced sterilization for the good of society. Following the Supreme Court ruling, American states began implementing eugenics laws en masse. Laws were passed relating to interracial marriage, immigration restrictions, contraceptives, and by the 1930s, over 30 states had laws permitting forced sterilizations. As a result, an estimated 70,000 Americans were forcibly sterilized against their will. These were mostly institutionalized and incarcerated minority women, and California was the state that performed the most forced sterilizations. The AAAS and the NAS played a large role in the promotion and acceptance of eugenics and forced sterilization in America.
So she'll understand. Well, we thought it necessary to present your family's case to the State Medical Commission. And after an examination, they decided there was but one important action to take: to have your entire family sterilized. Why, what's that? I don't know what you're talking about. Well, we investigated your family's history, Alice. And most of the past 3 generations have been feeble-minded, congenital cripples, or habitual drunkards. Instead of improving, each generation is more of a problem. Now, in this state, we have a law which provides for such people to have an operation so there won't be any more children. I see. Now, we've placed your brothers in institutions where they'll be properly cared for. You can go back to your job soon. I'll arrange to have it held open for you. But I'm keeping my job. I'm not going anywhere. Now, you're going to the hospital too, Alice. But there's nothing wrong with me. Perhaps not. You wouldn't want to marry some fine young man and be ashamed of the children you had.
Hitler was a huge fan of the American eugenics movement, as well as their laws, praising them in his books and speeches frequently. Hitler specifically praised the United States eugenics policy in Mein Kampf, stating, "There is today one state in which at least weak beginnings toward a better conception of immigration are noticeable. Of course, it is not our model German Republic, but the United States." And the Nazis would model their own eugenics laws on those found in the United States, before ultimately taking them to conclusions no one could imagine. Following World War II, eugenics would begin to fall out of favor, but forced sterilizations would continue in the US until the 1970s. The AAAS would not formally apologize for their role in the eugenics wave for nearly 100 years, publishing in 2021, quote, "It is clear that the AAAS, science, and many in the scientific community supported the biggest proponents of eugenics in the early 20th century, when the ideology started gaining wider traction. We must never forget that the unwavering march towards scientific progress is sometimes built on a problematic past. Unless we understand the depths of these problems, we will continue building on rotting foundations." This apology demonstrates that America's elite scientific organizations can change their view on big scientific topics with vast real-world implications, even if it takes decades and costs many lives. The history of eugenics is vast, and there are links in the description if you want to learn more, as this brief summary focused mainly on the AAAS and NAS influence. Understanding the American Association for the Advancement of Sciences, the National Academy of Sciences, and their relationship and influences on policy and scientific culture are important if we want to understand the US scientific community's relationship with UFOs. These two groups have huge influence on what is science and what is pseudoscience. And by covering the history of these groups and eugenics, we saw how something that was once accepted as scientific fact, having broad societal, cultural implications, could in fact be changed. Okay, now back to UFOs. With the release of the Condon Committee report recommending that the Air Force stop investigating UFOs, the NAS and the AAAS were the only scientific organizations in the country with the authority to override the Condon Committee and change American scientific culture on UFOs. Historically, the AAAS and NAS had not really engaged UFOs, deferring to the Air Force conclusions, but both organizations had brushed with the topic before. The NAS was responsible for convening the conference at Green Bank that led to the creation of SETI and the Order of the Dolphin. And when Edward Condon was being investigated by the House Un-American Activities Committee, the AAAS rallied behind him. And at the 1948 AAAS conference, President Truman spoke with Condon nearby about the importance of scientific freedom. And in 1952, Edward Condon was elected to president of the AAAS. Condon's influence in the AAAS did not seem promising for the UFO issue. But the AAAS did publish Hynek's first pro-UFO letter, UFOs Merit Scientific Study, so there was hope. But this hope would take a major hit when the National Academy of Sciences, the organization signed into existence by Abraham Lincoln, released their review of the Condon Report in June of 1969. The National Academy of Sciences review was in complete agreement of the Condon Committee. They wrote that the methodology of the Condon Committee was sound. There was no basis that UFOs are shrouded in official secrecy. There is no evidence that UFOs are indicative of non-human advanced craft. And finally, they agree with the recommendations of the Condon Committee that the Air Force should shut down the UFO study. The final hope for a scientific revolution on UFOs was the AAAS. And the efforts of James McDonald and J. Allen Hynek would crescendo at the AAAS annual conference. Due to the UFO hype in the country, Thornton Page and Carl Sagan co-chaired a AAAS special committee on UFOs, and they organized a UFO Symposium to take place at the 1969 AAAS conference. Edward Condon tried to use his status as a past AAAS president to prevent the UFO Symposium from taking place, saying it would tarnish the AAAS name. But Condon was unsuccessful, as Carl Sagan and Thornton Page were adamant that this symposium take place. Philip Klass was not scheduled to speak at the event, but he would prepare a 14-page condemnation portfolio of Hynek and McDonald to be distributed at the conference. The AAAS annual conference, where Edison revealed the mechanisms of the light bulb, where Alexander Graham Bell revealed the photophone, where Hubbard revealed his expanding universe theory, and where Einstein first spoke before an American audience, would once again find itself at a historic juncture in American science, as the 1969 AAAS conference would decide how UFOs would be treated by the American scientific community for decades. Among the scheduled speakers were J. Allen Hynek, Dr. Carl Sagan, Dr. James McDonald, Robert Wood of McDonnell Douglas, Frank Drake, Philip Morrison, Thornton Page, and many others, and they were to argue why the AAAS should or shouldn't acknowledge UFOs as a scientific pursuit. However, 1 week before the AAAS Symposium, the Air Force would kill all hopes at improving the UFO study when they announced a plan to close Project Blue Book. Citing the Robertson Panel, the various Air Force UFO investigations, and the Condon Committee, the Air Force released a press release which stated, "As a result of investigating UFO reports since 1948, the conclusions of Project Blue Book are 1. No UFO reported, investigated, and evaluated by the Air Force has ever given any indication of a threat to our national security. 2. There has been no evidence submitted to or discovered by the Air Force that the sightings categorized as unidentified represent technological developments or principles beyond the range of present-day scientific knowledge. And 3. There has been no evidence indicating that the sightings categorized as unidentified are extraterrestrial vehicles." The AAAS Symposium was now no longer even a factor. Even if Hynek and McDonald were able to convince their fellow scientists to take UFOs seriously, the Air Force closing Project Blue Book and stating that there was nothing to UFOs killed scientific interest in the subject. And behind the scenes, senior Air Force officials were meeting with the AAAS leadership to ensure that they would disapprove of UFOs as a scientific pursuit. Because of the Air Force announcement, instead of being an event that progressed UFOs in the scientific community, the 1969 AAAS conference became a bookend in the flying saucer era that began all those years ago. Thornton Page would speak.
Of course, it's appropriate to start with reference to the scientific study of UFOs prepared by Dr. Condon and his 36-member staff at the University of Colorado during 1967 and 1968. As Dr. Roberts has already said, the symposium was delayed for a year so that the full content of the Condon report could be read and digested after its publication in January of this year. The Bantam Book paperback edition of the Condon report contains some 1,000 pages, including case studies, analyses along several different scientific disciplines, and a 20-year historical summary.
And in the face of defeat amongst their scientific colleagues, James McDonald, the University of Arizona astronomer, and J. Allen Hynek, the former chief scientific advisor to Project Blue Book, would give some of their most remembered speeches.
The next paper is entitled Science in Default, 22 Years of Inadequate UFO Investigations, by Dr. James E. McDonald, Senior Physicist, Institute for Atmospheric Physics, and Professor of Meteorology, University of Arizona.
Dear Mr. Chairman, the AAAS, I think, is to be congratulated for organizing and holding this symposium. I fully agree with the remarks that Dr. Sagan made, that there is a scientific obligation to examine questions such as that of the unidentified flying objects, an obligation of the public to science itself. And as the title of my remarks indicates, my study of the problem leads me to take the position that we in science are in default, have been in default for 2 decades, for failing to close with a problem that created such widespread concern, both here and abroad, failing to close with it long ago. I want to get a
The next paper is entitled 21 Years of UFO Reports. It's by Professor J. Allen Hynek, who's chairman of the Department of Astronomy and director of the Lindheimer Astronomical Research Center at Northwestern University. Professor Hynek.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My role here today is that of a reporter, to report to you on my score or so years of experience with UFO reports. Note that I don't say UFOs. I was asked in 1948 as an astronomer to review the UFO reports received by the Air Force to determine how many of them originated from misperceptions of astronomical objects. This consultancy continued across the years and gave me the chance to monitor the flow of UFO reports submitted to the Air Force and to observe the Air Force handling of the problem as first one, then another officer took charge of Project Blue Book. I became increasingly aware that the phenomenon of UFO reports not only persisted in this country, but in many areas over the world, and that it didn't disappear as one might expect a craze or a fad to disappear. And it began to concern me that if there were some worldwide compulsion to report strange things, why this particular subset of strange reports out of an infinite universe of possible strange reports? The degree of strangeness is certainly one dimension of a filtered UFO report. The higher the strangeness index, the more information elements which defy explanation in ordinary physical terms the report contains. For instance, there are more than 100 reports on record of UFOs that reportedly caused car ignition failures. A typical case runs something like this. Suddenly, as if from nowhere, a bright light appears. As it stops to hover over the car lights dim or fail, and the engine dies, the radio either stops and has a lot of static on it, and the windshield wipers stop. Often the occupants of the car report feeling hot and prickly. After a few minutes, the apparition leaves and the car returns to normal operation, but the witnesses often do not. The majority of such witnesses, contrary to popular belief, were originally highly skeptical about UFOs. Suddenly they had an experience which profoundly affected them, sometimes traumatically. Yet they know only too well that they will be targets for ridicule if they report, for as they confess, they have often in the past ridiculed others. So certain was the Air Force, at least publicly, that all UFO reports must represent normal things, that they saw no point to serious investigation. And most of the time that I acted as consultant of the Air Force, I repeatedly urged immediate reaction capability and proper scientific investigation, but to no avail. We have really here the crux of the problem. Neither you, as informed, active scientists, nor the public have access to this information. Unfortunately, you who may wish to be informed about UFOs must get your information in the intellectual alleys where it is written like forbidden words on the back fences of literature, the pulp magazines, the sensation, adventure, mystery, and sex magazines. There is in this country not one scientific journal in which I could publish a well-documented UFO case, and hence effectively violate the methodological criteria governing the advance of science, which, as he states, are: 1, it must be possible for new observational data to occur, that is, the existing conceptual framework of science, or the attitudes of scientists, must not rule out such new data a priori. 2, that the existing conceptual framework must allow new concepts, principles, laws, etc. to be formulated to interpret and explain the new observational data. Finally, may I say that although I know of no hypothesis that adequately covers the mountainous evidence, this should not, nor must not, deter us from following the advice of Schrödinger to be curious, capable of being astonished, and eager to find out. Thank you.
On January 30th, 1970, Project Blue Book would officially close its doors.
Conclusions of Project Blue Book were: 1. No UFO reported, investigated, and evaluated by the Air Force has ever given any indication of threat to our national security. 2. There is no evidence submitted that sightings categorized as unidentified represent technological developments or principles beyond the range of present-day scientific knowledge. And 3, there is no evidence indicating that these unidentified objects are extraterrestrial.
Following the close of Project Blue Book, it is suspected that the study of UFOs moved into the private industry and black budget programs hidden from the public and congressional oversight. The close of Project Blue Book went largely unnoticed amongst the American public at the time. The late 1960s and early 1970s were a tumultuous time in the US. There were the political assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy. There was President Nixon's resignation following Watergate. And in response to the US involvement in Vietnam and the mandatory draft, the anti-war movement in the country was rapidly growing. UFOs were simply not a priority to the American public of the late 1960s and early 1970s. The AAAS would not classify UFOs as a legitimate scientific pursuit. and UFOs were deemed pseudoscience by America's premier scientific organization. There was one thing that the 1969 AAAS UFO Symposium scientists did agree on, and that was that the Project Blue Book records should be preserved for future generations, and not destroyed as the Air Force had indicated they planned on doing. The 1969 AAAS UFO Symposium scientists sent a formal recommendation to the Secretary of State requesting that the Blue Book files not be destroyed. This formal recommendation was signed by both the debunkers and the UFO advocates present at the 1969 AAAS conference. Apart from this, however, the AAAS agreed with the Condon Committee and Project Blue Book that there is nothing to UFOs. The AAAS would rarely feature UFOs as a subject matter in their scientific journal, and when the AAAS would publish papers on UFOs, they would present them in a negative, demeaning light. For example, during the entire decade of the 1970s, a time period covering 120 issues of Science, the AAAS published less than 5 original papers on UFOs, and all were in a negative light. This paper, titled Status Inconsistency Theory and Flying Saucer Sightings, published in a 1976 issue of Science, posits that college-educated white males frustrated with their positions in life are the ones who see UFOs, completely ignoring UFO sightings in other countries and those by women. This is the kind of UFO article one can find in Science Journal. The subject of UFOs would be permanently pushed to the fringes and not accepted in mainstream scientific culture. NICAP, APRO, and various other UFO groups would all take a sharp hit in membership. Donald Kehoe, America's first mainstream UFO researcher, was voted out of NICAP by the board of directors.
For more than 20 years, Major Donald E. Kehoe, U.S. Marine Corps retired, has been reporting on the world of flying saucers. I understand, Major Kehoe, that you believe that we are being visited by intelligently controlled vehicles from other planets.
I do, and I agree with the Air Force. They've had a secret conclusion to that effect since 1948.
Kehoe would continue to investigate for a couple of years, publishing one more book that explored the relationship between UFOs and nuclear weapons, but he would then take a step back due to old age. James McDonald, the University of Arizona astronomer, who convinced Hynek to break with the Air Force, and who spoke with Hynek at the AAAS conference, was still adamant that society and science should take UFOs seriously. He continued to advocate for and investigate UFOs independently following the close of Project Blue Book. James McDonald faced tremendous amounts of ridicule for pursuing UFOs, which took a toll on him.
Another thing that's common all over the world is the scoffing and ridicule from official sources, from my fellow scientists, largely, well, almost entirely.
And James McDonald was soon hit with a string of misfortunes. Philip Klass would continue his letter-writing campaigns, causing James McDonald to lose many of his research grants for being deemed too political. Then, in a separate congressional hearing discussing the ozone layer, James McDonald was publicly ridiculed by Congressman Silvio Ocante, who in a mocking tone asked James McDonald about little green men, and not the ozone layer, to which the entire audience laughed. Then, James McDonald began to have his personal belongings tampered with. On multiple occasions while investigating UFOs, his luggage would disappear from the planes he was flying on. And he claimed that he was being followed around by men in dark suits driving unmarked cars without license plates. His daughter was raped and nearly murdered while she was attending Harvard University, and the attacker was never found. These misfortunes happening in such a short succession of time was too much for Mrs. McDonald, who filed for divorce, and this would push James to his limit. He would drive himself to the Arizona desert and take his own life in April of 1971. There are some who allege he was murdered, as in the days before his death, he had expressed to Robert Wood and Jacques Vallée great enthusiasm in his research into the connection between different frequencies and UFOs, even going so as far to claiming that he had solved it. It is not confirmed he was murdered, but still, the death of James McDonald cemented the divorce of science and UFOs in America. J. Allen Hynek, the astronomer and scientific advisor and public debunker for the Air Force for nearly 20 years, would continue to investigate UFOs independently following the close of Project Blue Book.
The choice is we can either call all these people over these years, all of them crazy, or we must say there is a real phenomenon there that is worthy of investigation.
Dr. Alan Hynek, astronomer and former UFO investigator for the Air Force. Reports of UFO sightings continue, so Hynek formed the Center for UFO Studies to provide a place where the reports can be received and studied by scientists.
Hynek would join Jim and Coral Lorenzen, who were still running APRO, and together they would help foster the UFO research community.
On the outskirts of Tucson, Arizona, is the headquarters of the oldest of the UFO study groups, the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization. It was founded in 1952 by Jim and Coral Lorenzen.
We always expected, I think, in the early days that the mystery would be solved the next day. But after a few years went by, we began to change our attitude. So we began to look for the goal of collecting data that can be used as a base for scientific study.
Objects which are obviously beyond our technology, flying around the skies, occasionally landing, things or entities getting out of them, taking soil samples and vegetable samples, sometimes rabbits or something, whatever they get their hands on. We ought to know who they are, where they're from, and why they're here.
NICAP in Maryland, APRO in Arizona, and MUFON in Quincy, Illinois. All three of the UFO groups are chartered as non-profit educational organizations.
The ridiculed UFO research community has its own rich and vast history, which we cover in other videos on this channel. Full of interesting cases, compelling testimony, misinformation, cover-ups, and a bunch of other crazy things.
We attack this entirely from a scientific viewpoint because the people are very serious. And they're from all walks of life, from all occupations, all ages, but they have one common interest, that is resolving the UFO phenomenon. Do UFOs exist? How are they powered? What's their system of propulsion? Where do they originate? Where are they from? And what can we learn from these little fellows that drive them?
Edward Condon, the Berkeley physicist who helped pioneer quantum mechanics in America, and who had resigned from the Manhattan Project in protest, and would later take on the Air Force UFO contract, would continue to deride UFOs until his death in 1974. Donald Menzel, America's first prominent UFO debunker along with Hynek, would pass away in 1976, and he also maintained until his death that all UFOs have prosaic explanations. Thornton Page seems to have been conflicted about his role with the UFO issue during the Blue Book era, and he would make several contradictory statements over the years on his stance on UFOs and government secrecy, at times seeming pro-UFO, other times maintaining a debunking position. Ultimately, he would step away from the UFOs before passing in the 1990s. Hector Quintanilla was happy to get out of the UFO business he had grown sick of, and he maintained until he died that there was nothing to UFOs.
Quintanilla, he was the last director of the Air Force's Project Blue Book.
There was a folder.
Okay.
A folder about as big as this, with newspaper accounts of what transpired out at the ranch or wherever it was. But there was no formal correspondence that I could find with regards to Roswell.
He told me Blue Book's evaluation of the case was it was nothing more than a balloon, and that's the end of it.
Carl Sagan would continue to be very influential in American science. Sagan continued to assist NASA with various projects like the Mariner, Viking, Voyager, and Galileo NASA probes, and these probes are sent out to explore Mars, Jupiter, and the outer solar system. Carl Sagan accomplished many things in science, and in his personal activism, which he took later in life. Carl Sagan would also continue to be influential in American scientific debunking. A couple of years after the AAAS UFO Symposium, Carl Sagan would organize another AAAS conference in which the American scientific community would evaluate the works of Immanuel Velikovsky, the scientist who theorized Earth suffered from many ancient catastrophes and had ancient civilizations that were advanced. This is a story for another day, but I do find it interesting that Carl Sagan was front and center for the American scientific community's abandonment of UFOs and ancient civilizations and catastrophes. Carl Sagan would also find the Planetary Society, and with Frank Drake, Sagan would continue to help run and promote SETI, which claimed to be searching for alien life using various types of high-powered radars and detection methods. And like I said, although the claimed goals of SETI should be admired, these goals were undertaken with the predisposition that there was nothing to UFO reports on Earth. SETI, and Sagan's promotion of it, assured the scientific community our best scientists were actively searching for ETs, and terrestrial UFO reports were simply misidentifications and hoaxes. The Air Force dismissed UFOs, the scientific establishment dismissed UFOs, and now you had Carl Sagan also dismissing UFOs while actively looking for alien life. Carl Sagan was also one of the founders of the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry, an organization that promotes scientific skepticism. And this organization would feature members like the magician James Randi and Philip Klass, the UFO debunker who targeted James McDonald back during the Condon years. This organization promotes scientific skepticism to claims of the paranormal and supernatural. And this organization would also publish the Skeptical Inquirer, a scientific journal that also promotes skepticism. And Carl Sagan, along with Philip Klass, the young UFO debunking voices of the late 1960s, would continue to be prominent UFO debunkers for the remainder of the 20th century.
The question arises, might there have been a visit to the Earth in historical times? There are popular books on this subject. It's an idea which people find exciting. It's a kind of scientific justification of theological belief which people would rather believe in any case. It's a kind of modern dress for old-time religion. Well, what about that? Is that possible or not? I can only say that you can't exclude the possibility, but there's not a smidgen of evidence that is compelling.
Fabrications and an attempt to cover up the truth.
You are a goddamned liar, Mike Rogers, and I have caught you in falsehood after.
Well, while sitting back there and listening and watching the two ladies' story, I got a telepathic message, which seemed to be from an extraterrestrial saying those two ladies are telling fantasy. Now, I don't know. It was a telepathic message I got.
Well, let's assume that they're not. Most reports of unidentified flying objects turn out to be something else, like the refracted image of a bright planet or the re-entry of an artificial satellite. Some are psychological aberrations, some are hoaxes. Never is there any compelling physical evidence.
Let's get the people in authority to say what they're doing with our tax dollars and what they're finding out.
Okay, Phil, you say what?
Well, Oprah, I have never read a book labeled nonfiction that is riddled with so many errors of fact.
You're talking about
seen me or met me.
Well, you know,
there are all kinds of errors of fact.
Again, I would say that the extraordinary evidence that is required here is simply unavailable. These are just stories, and there are all kinds of people, all kinds of reasons why people tell stories.
Carl Sagan was also largely influential in fostering the next generation's prominent television UFO debunkers. Both Bill Nye and Neil deGrasse Tyson would credit Carl Sagan with being the reason for their success, and these men would promote UFO skepticism on televisions long after Sagan's passing. I do want to reiterate that Carl Sagan did accomplish many amazing feats and advanced American science in many great ways, but we do also have to come to terms with the role that he played in the American scientific community's relationship with UFOs.
We have looked close up at dozens of new worlds that we never saw before. And unless we're so stupid as to destroy ourselves, there are going to be people exploring those worlds. There are going to be human habitations on those worlds. We're going to be moving out into space in the next century. And I'm fortunate enough to have played a role in the first preliminary reconnaissance of the solar system. That's a terrifically exciting thing.
Interestingly, according to Carl Sagan's biography, Sagan would have secret CIA meetings through the 1980s with Dr. Kit Green, a prominent figure in UFO lore, which I find interesting. The American scientific community cited the Air Force conclusion that there was nothing to UFOs, and the Air Force based their conclusion on three major things: their various UFO investigations, the CIA's Robertson panel, and the Condon Committee. Each of these was promoted as a thorough scientific investigation that determined there was nothing to UFOs. You often hear people say that the government could never keep a secret like UFOs because there would be leakers and whistleblowers. It is important to note that every step of the way, from the Air Force UFO investigations to the Robertson panel to the Condon Committee, the main basis for the conclusions that there was nothing to UFOs that would be adopted by the American scientific community, there is a string of whistleblowers claiming that UFOs do exist, exhibit characteristics beyond human control, beyond human potential, and that the Air Force was not interested in genuine scientific pursuit of UFOs. I think it is important to cover some of these notable quotes from those involved in the Air Force UFO investigations throughout the years. Clyde Tombaugh, scientific consultant to Project Twinkle and discoverer of Pluto.
Well, of the three different types of objects that I have seen, I would say the most extraordinary one was one I saw in 1949 in August in Las Cruces from my backyard. On that particular evening, my wife and her mother and I were enjoying the cool air, and I was admiring the beautiful transparent sky with the stars, and I happened to be looking overhead, and suddenly I spied a strange group of lights moving, and I said, look, and they saw it immediately, and then I would say they were visible for about 3 seconds of time, and they disappeared at a height of about 35 degrees above the southeastern horizon. No sound, and they seemed to kind of pale out. The rectangles of feeble light seemed to foreshorten into slits. And I have never seen anything like it before or since, and I'm very much puzzled as to what the thing was.
Hermann Oberth, father of German rocketry and NASA rocket scientist, and mentor to Wernher von Braun.
After so many witnesses have seen the so-called flying saucers, their existence cannot longer be denied. I believe that these flying objects come from another solar system.
Lieutenant Colonel Charles Brown, AFOSI officer during Project Grudge.
Our organization was the worldwide investigative agency for the Air Force for any unidentified flying objects. This lasted for about 2 years. The project name was known as Project Grudge. It was a predecessor to a project known as Blue Book, which Ed Ruppelt headed. During my experience with it, I would collect the data from, I didn't collect it, it was sent into my office. I analyzed it. As a pilot investigator, I was able to offer some bits of advice to during the review as an analyst of these various documentary reports, if you will, or documents, I became clearly convinced that there was substance to what was being reported, in that we had ground visual, ground radar, airborne visual, and airborne radar confirmation of some of these sightings. The individuals who made the sightings were everything from airline pilots, military pilots, police officers, some of the people that your lives depend upon on a daily basis. These are very reputable and credible people.
Wilbert Smith, the head of Project Magnet, the Canadian UFO study which collaborated with Project Blue Book.
In the study of unidentified flying objects and physical principles which might appear to be involved, the conclusions reached by Project Magnet and contained in the official report were based on a rigid statistical analysis of sighting reports and were as follows. There is a 91% probability that at least some of the sightings are of real objects of unknown origin. There is about 60% probability that these objects are alien vehicles. That is, alien meaning not of earthly fabrication.
William Coleman, Public Information Officer for Project Blue Book.
It presented the first close-up account by highly reliable witnesses. The object described led some of the staff to postulate an extraterrestrial theory, and they wrote up an estimate of the situation, which at the time was classified top secret. suggesting that the saucers were from outer space.
We have not been able to come up with a logical explanation, at least our scientists have not. The only plausible explanation that would explain all of these sightings is the theory that these could be intelligently controlled vehicles controlled by an alien species, alien to this planet.
Robert Friend, former chief of Project Blue Book.
Things that people have experienced are real because we've been able to, in many instances, track down exactly what the cause was. But there is a small percent that we have not yet been able to solve. And what I believe, and recommended in 2 staff studies, is that an agency such as NASA or an advanced projects agency take on the task of doing the analysis, the in-depth analysis of these things.
Jenny Ziedman, secretary to J. Allen Hynek.
By the time Project Blue Book was finished, after 20 years, 21 years, I think Allen Hynek had come to hate the Air Force. I think the Air Force had come to hate Allen Hynek. Allen Hynek came to recognize that UFOs represented a veritable scientific mystery.
Dr. J. Allen Hynek, chief scientific advisor for Project Blue Book.
My association with Project Blue Book, I know very well that it was not a scientific project. Also, I also know that they never would notify the media when an interesting case came up. They did everything they could to keep it down. So they definitely withheld information.
The sentiment that there was nothing to UFOs would permeate through American culture and society. The history of the flying saucer program, the big UFO waves, or the characters involved would not be taught in schools. And unless someone was actively looking for UFO books in libraries and bookstores, their main exposure to UFOs would be the tabloid papers while waiting to check out for groceries. And to the average American, the subject of UFO is relegated to one of pseudoscience, deserving ridicule and stigma.
I've been studying.
You seem quite reserved tonight.
I've been studying UFOs. Did you know there are UFOs out here flying around, unidentified?
This would be the place for them, Southern California.
I'm serious. They cited a bunch over Georgia.
There was a protest in Washington over the weekend, a protest of people, by people, who want more information about UFOs. This is Operation Right to Know, and there's a picture of these people. When I first saw this, I thought it was another gay rights march in D.C., and then I looked closer and found out that it could have been.
Did you see a UFO?
I did, and the rest of the account, well, I didn't, it was unidentified flying object, okay?
Over the years, there would be many attempts at lobbying Congress and the government to release the UFO files and do a proper investigation. But decade after decade, they failed. And although the UFO research community would investigate, as far as the official government position was concerned, they maintained the official position dictated in 1969 with the Condon Committee and the close of Project Blue Book. The UFOs do not exist, and they do not study them.
Neither the Air Force nor the CIA is investigating UFOs now, and officials do not like to talk about the subject.
Well, the Air Force position is that we investigated UFOs for 22 years, over 12,000 sightings.
Colonel Don Burgrave, U.S. Air Force.
About 95% of all the UFOs were explainable. They were weather phenomenon, they were balloons, they were airplanes, they were lightning. And we concluded as a result of our investigations, which was carried out very scientifically, that one, there was no threat to the security of the United States, and there was no evidence that we could ever locate that an extraterrestrial vehicle had landed.
When CNN recently asked the Air Force about the possible existence of movie film of the Bentwaters UFO, the official Air Force response was, The United States Air Force stopped investigating UFOs in 1969.
There was no evidence of threat to national security. There was no evidence that we had been visited by extraterrestrial vehicles. And finally, there was no evidence that after evaluating these UFO sightings that there was any indication of scientific knowledge, the existence of scientific knowledge beyond the present state of...
But the Air Force says this closes the book on extraterrestrials who were no more than high-altitude dummies testing parachutes.
Typical test dummy used by the Air Force during the 1950s.
The Air Force showed movies of crash test dummies, insisting this is what people saw when they reported alien bodies in a flying saucer over Roswell, New Mexico in 1947.
This, to goodness, reminds me of some people's obsession with UFOs and the Hale-Bopp comet some days. There's no reason for that. There's no evidence of that. There will not be evidence of that.
We cannot substantiate the existence of UFOs, and we are not harboring remains of UFOs.
Good to see you, sir. If you're elected president, will you finally trust the people enough to tell them about UFOs, what the story is? Half the public believes that they are real. Would you finally tell us what the hell's going on?
Sure, I will. Since the statement made by George Bush last July, there's been a vicious rumor circulating in the UFO community that you've been read into the UFO program. So my question to you is, in any of your government jobs, have you ever been briefed on the subject of UFOs? And if you have, when was it and what were you told?
Well, if I had been briefed on that, I'm sure it was probably classified and I couldn't talk about it.
Another petition, this one with 12,000 signatories, reads, formally acknowledge an extraterrestrial presence engaging the human race. The White House responded. Phil Larson, the Office of Science and Technology Policy, wrote in part, thank you for signing the petition asking the Obama administration to acknowledge an extraterrestrial presence here on Earth. The U.S. government has no evidence that any life exists outside our planet or that an extraterrestrial presence has contacted or engaged any member of the human race. In addition, there's no credible information to suggest that any evidence is being hidden from the public eye.
I also wondered if you saw that New York Times story yesterday about Mrs. Clinton promising to get to the bottom of the UFO and Area 51 conspiracies. And I wondered if the president would like to beat her to the punch by, showing his degree of transparency on this issue, which is of concern to a lot of Americans.
I have to admit I don't have a tab in my briefing book for Area 51 today.
Or a joke.
Or a joke. Maybe it has. Part of a grand conspiracy. I'm not aware of any plans the president has to make public any information about this, but...
This position, dictated by the Condon Committee and the close of Blue Book, that UFOs do not exist and that the government does not study them, was the official position of the US government and Air Force for nearly 50 years, until 2017.
Tonight, CNN has learned the Pentagon had a secretive program to research UFOs like the one Fravor spotted. The project was called the Advanced Aviation Threat Identification Program.
Now, just a short time ago, Senator Reid responded to CNN, saying he's, quote, proud of this program and its groundbreaking studies.
When it was revealed that there was an official program to study UFOs. In that time, we have seen the release of videos of alleged UFOs.
Dude, this is a fucking drone, bro. There's a whole fleet of them. Look on the ASA. My gosh. Nickel 61 Tango, Logic on it.
Accompanied with a newfound seriousness when discussed in the media.
3 more U.S. senators received a classified briefing about UFOs at the Pentagon, or in current lingo, unidentified aerial phenomena.
Some United States senators have received an actual briefing on this UFO phenomenon. And now, like you, I always wonder why this isn't a bigger story. Listen.
Various countries around the world are also beginning to seriously address UFOs. Japan has created UFO reporting guidelines.
エスパー長官との会談の中でも話題に上りました。
河野大臣は先月の日米防衛相会談で自衛隊とアメリカ軍の間でも UFO 未確認
Brazil has held a congressional hearing on UFOs.
Mestrando em Física pelo Centro Brasileiro de Pesquisas Físicas e é funcionário de carreira.
Enquanto isso, as autoridades tentavam descredibilizar as testemunhas.
Canada is opening a UFO study.
For the first time in 30 years, the Canadian government is set to carry out a study on UFOs. It's called the Sky Canada Project, and it will seek to better understand unidentified flying objects.
And academia is beginning to embrace UFOs with initiatives at Harvard, Stanford, and NASA. The head of the UFO program has even briefed the National Academy of Sciences. And we have seen members of Congress hold the first Congressional UFO hearings since the Edward Roosh Symposium in 1968.
In the first hearing of its kind in 50 years, defense officials confirmed sightings of unidentified flying objects, or as the military calls them, UAPs. But
we have detected no emanations within the UAP task force that would suggest it's anything non-terrestrial.
Officials said there have been no collisions between U.S. aircraft and the objects, but there have been 11.
We do have reason to be concerned until we're able to rule out any threat to the traveling public, to those military pilots, to our military facilities, and other places.
Well, I don't believe they're coming from foreign adversaries. If they were, why, that would suggest that they have a technology which is in a whole different sphere than anything we understand. And frankly, China and Russia just aren't there, and either are we, by the way, so I'm not worried about it
For too long, the stigma associated with UAPs has gotten in the way of good intelligence analysis. Pilots avoided reporting or were laughed at when they did.
Bogus. The report raised more questions than answers about unidentified objects in the skies. It stunk of a government cover-up.
I have seen evidence of craft that I am not familiar with any of our allies or adversaries or even our country possessing. I've seen.
And then there's still about 170 that are still not determined. So the assessment is really important.
But Roswell's a very interesting place with a lot of people that would like to know what's going on.
But what is true, and I'm actually being serious here, is that there's footage and records of objects in the skies that we don't know exactly what they are. We can't explain how they moved, their trajectory.
We have not been able to come up with a logical explanation. At least our scientists have not. The only plausible explanation that would explain all of these sightings is the theory that these could be intelligently controlled vehicles controlled by an alien species, alien to this planet.
In my association with Project Blue Book, I know very well that it was not a scientific project. Also, I also know that they never would notify the media when an interesting case came up. They did everything they could